Chapter 151. Welcome to the Oracle City. Tim, they made you eat soup all through your ordeal? Jake asked, not without surprise. Something like that. The teenager responded with an embarrassed laugh as he scratched his head, his unstable voice just beginning to break. In any case, it was neither the right time nor the right place to talk. The cawing of the digesters could still be heard, and all kinds of people, animals and aliens were still fleeing in their direction, the agitation and panic making them all the more dangerous. The sooner they left the Cyan Desert, the better they would feel, once they were in a safe place. If such a place existed on this damn planet outside the Oracle cities, they would have plenty of time to tell each other about their adventures and make up for lost time. Let's get out of here, we'll talk later. Jake cut the chat short before resuming his run at a pace everyone could keep up with. Upon realizing that Will and Tim could follow his initial rhythm, he increased his original pace until he reached a speed where Will and Tim could still keep up, but were unable to speak more than a few words without running out of breath. Shockingly, Will lagged slightly behind Tim. The child probably had lower ether stats than they did, but his physical condition was excellent. Unlike the former businessman, Tim's ordeal seemed to have included a good proportion of physical activity. Jake wondered what rewards Will had received, since in his eyes the Oracle would never give an ordeal that was useless. Even if someone was physically handicapped or unable to learn to fight, the ordeal would eventually be painful and challenging enough to increase their survivability. If the ordeal itself had nothing to do with survival, the ordeal's end reward would have to make up for some of this deficit. In any case, the trotting speed of the group was higher than that of the best marathon runner. Jake, Sarah, and Kyle could probably keep up this pace indefinitely, their hearts beating only a few times a minute. In less than 2 hours, the group finally left the salt desert. Just as they had entered, but in reverse, the salt sand gradually became scarcer, revealing vegetation reminiscent of a savanna. The only difference was that the tall grasses and tree leaves wavered between blueberry blue and magenta. The trunks of the few shrubs in their field of vision were pale green and had a smooth, moist texture like that of a young shoot. However, to the touch the texture was clearly that of the bark of an adult deciduous tree. The earth was dark blue and relatively dry, while the sky had turned cloudy in an instant, with red micro-lightning scattered across the cumulonimbus clouds clearly reminding them that this environment had nothing to do with the earth. In fact, even with his constitution and high vitality, Jake had a slight respiratory discomfort and his head was spinning a little, suggesting to him that the atmosphere was somewhat different. Oxygen levels seemed to be poorer, while the slight feeling of daze and euphoria betrayed the presence of other molecules in the atmosphere, such as nitrous oxide or something with similar effects. He could have used the scan of his bracelet to find out for sure, but it cost ether, and as long as the path prioritizing his survival didn't make him take a detour, he had nothing to fear. Before the ordeal, it could have been different. Sarah, Kyle, and Crunch had no particular problem breathing this air, even though his cat sneezed several times trying to sniff the alien herbs a little too closely. He tried to chew on one of them thinking he had found a good alternative to his catnip, but he immediately spat it out in a hissing motion as if he had just met his nemesis. The cat then peed on it for revenge before waddling behind the group again, determined not to touch anything more. The cat's little game made them laugh for a short while, relaxing the atmosphere. Will and Tim could breathe the air harmlessly, but their running pace had slowed, a sign that their bodies weren't fully able to withstand such a drop in oxygen levels. Jake felt that the Oracle City couldn't be far away. A Slail had assured them at the time that an Oracle City was always within 200 kilometers of their position anywhere on the planet. Considering the snowy hill where they had met the instructor, the map from his Oracle device indicated that they had traveled almost 150 kilometers just to reach the red cube. The red cube was to the northeast of the hill from the cardinal points he had arbitrarily defined, while the nearest Oracle City was east of the cube. After 2 hours of jogging at more than 20 kilometers per hour, they couldn't have been very far. Jake thought that since then, they should have at least spotted the city walls or at least the tops of a few buildings. Even without that, signs of passage such as overturned earth or just typical noises of human, animal, or alien activity should have started to appear. Paradoxically, there was none of that. After sinking a few more kilometers into the tall grass of another exoplanet, Jake finally discovered the signs of activity he was looking for. The tall grass had been cut or trampled in some places, proving that several groups of individuals had been there before them recently. Considering that Cho Min-ho's faction was also on his way to the nearest Oracle City, these could be their tracks. Unfortunately, Jake wasn't an expert in tracking and couldn't confirm anything. Over the next few kilometers, the grasses grew higher and higher, overtaking them in height, whilst ugly brambles began to stand in their way. The groups of humans or aliens that had passed through before them had already made their way up the path with claws or blades, and Jake and his group took advantage of this by going directly along these preformed paths. After a while, a ravine halted their progress. A huge gulf several hundred meters long cut the route, but to their dismay, their shadow guide was urging them to jump. It threw itself into the ravine, vanishing after a few meters. Jake peered over the precipice, the depth of which was impossible to determine, and threw a pebble picked up at the edge of it. Even with his superhuman hearing, he didn't hear any impact, even after several minutes, which was rather strange. With the recent misadventures of his first ordeal, Jake was less inclined to trust the paths offered by the Oracle system. The proposed path conflicted with what his senses were telling him, and therefore, if it was a trap created by a digester or a super high-rank player, it would be like kicking himself. Wait for me here. I'll give you a signal if it's okay. Jake decisively ordered the rest of the group to wait while he checked to see if the proposed path was safe. Dropping off his backpack, he rummaged around inside looking for a rope, then tied himself to one end of it. He then asked Kyle and Sarah to hold the other end. With their current strength, supporting Jake's weight wasn't particularly difficult. In fact, he was more concerned about the rope. What was certain was that he had no intention of falling. It was just a last precaution in case he slipped or made a mistake. Clutching onto the edge of the cliff, Jake began to scale down the cliff. With a few good kicks, he broke the rock to create a notch where his hand could grip. He then let himself slide down until his hand reached the nick. Seeing that the rock indentation was holding, he gained confidence and repeated the process, quickly sliding down the few meters where the shadow guide disappeared. As he felt around the void with his foot, he felt no resistance and decided to continue his descent. As he passed the level where the shadow guide disappeared, his view changed, and a huge black cube appeared under his feet, completely blocking the ravine. When his boots made contact with it and disappeared inside, a system notification poked in his mind. Black cube leading to an Oracle City detected. Would you like to pay 1 ether point to enter? Hallelujah, they had finally found a safe place. At least the entrance ticket wasn't too expensive. The cost of living inside was yet to be discovered. Ignoring the notification, he climbed back up the cliff in seconds with an ease that would have made Spider-Man uncomfortable. Seeing him suddenly reappear before their eyes, the group was startled, but they quickly pulled themselves together. So, Will asked with some trepidation. He didn't like the idea of jumping into the void. We've reached our destination. Welcome to the Oracle City, Jake said with a smile. Chapter 152, The Oracle City. Even though they knew this from their shadow guide's directions, they were still relieved to hear the confirmation from Jake. It had only taken them a few hours to get there, but they had been under pressure for months because of their ordeal. Besides, except for Tim and Crunch maybe, all of them were dead except Jake. It must have had an effect on their psyche. Their real bodies may have escaped unharmed, but the pain and experience was real. Jake told them what he knew about the invisible black cube beneath and the ether fee that was charged to enter the Oracle City. After completing an ordeal, 1 ether point was just pocket money to them, so no one flinched. Jake then went down again, taking care to increase the number and depth of notches on the cliff so that everyone could go down without a problem. It probably wasn't necessary with the black cube underneath to intercept them, but it would be necessary to get back up the cliff. To be frank, he was even surprised that Cho Min-ho's group before them hadn't bothered to make the effort. The rock had been a little tamped in a few places, like when Jake had kicked to create a foothold, but not enough to make a safe footing. Thinking about it, he realized that it made sense. A normal person wishing to be a civilian didn't need to climb back up. If the Korean wanted to have some control over the members of his faction, controlling the entrances and exits of the Oracle City was a good option. As for Yerode and Lamine, they had probably jumped right in without a second thought given their character. The group then started to descend using the improvised steps created by Jake, the latter bringing up the rear in case of any unpleasant surprises. Everyone had tied themselves to the same rope, and if for any reason the group fell, he was confident that he could hold them back as long as the rope held. Will was the first to make contact with the black cube, his foot going through it, although he was quickly slowed down by a strange force when he tried to insist. Like Jake before him, he received a notification from the Oracle system, but where Jake had refused, he agreed to pay his entrance fee. After validating, the resistance that prevented him from entering the black cube disappeared and his body crawled inside. The rest of the group then repeated the process until only Jake was left in the precipice. When it was his turn again, this time he agreed to pay with his precious ether, and letting go of the cliff, his body disappeared into the black cube along with the rest of his companions. At first, the black space filling his vision reminded him of the inside of the red cube before and after his ordeal. However, the sensation didn't last. About a second later, his feet touched a hard surface and a city appeared before his eyes. The members of his group were not far from him, and as he scanned the area he recognized that they had not left the abyss. They were still inside the black cube. The only difference was that the clouds of streaked red lightning in the sky above them seemed much larger, as if they had become smaller. The cubes seemed to master space manipulating technology as the red cube had demonstrated. Whether they had been shrunk or the edge of the cube acted as a super zoom, one thing was for sure. The Oracle City was much bigger than they expected, and weirder too. At first glance, the city was a few kilometers in diameter. It was enough to house several 100,000 individuals, or even millions with buildings high enough. The problem was that the city itself was rather desolate. It was indeed teeming with life, since tens of thousands of humans, aliens, and strange animals of all kinds had already joined it. But for the moment, it looked more like a large outdoor camping area. Rudimentary tents or huts had been set up everywhere, so much so that the area where they had appeared had already become a veritable dumping ground. There were, however, elements that stood out from the rest in the heart of the city. These included the cluster of cubes of different colors and sizes in the center, which resembled a game of Tetris. Around these cubes, there were also buildings built in a kind of carbon gray metal completely devoid of any architectural identity. Again, these were blocks of different sizes, sometimes cubic, cylindrical, conical, pyramidal, or dome-shaped. There were no visible windows or doors, but messages of light engraved on the facades in a language with symbols more complex than anything he had seen so far indicated their function. Each of these symbols was like a Chinese sign, but with 10,000 times as many lines. The problem was that no one here seemed to be able to read and understand these texts. Touching the edge of the black cube, which had become invisible behind him, Jake received the notification again asking him if he wanted to exit at the cost of 1 unit of ether, confirming that at least getting out of town was not hard. As they wondered where to go first, a bat-sized silver spherical drone, strewn with veins of blue light, floated towards them without making a sound. Jake felt as if he'd just met back the drone that had delivered his bracelet. Distrustful, he prepared to fight, but a typical female voice like the one in the TV commercials sounded from the machine in good English. "Welcome to the shelter EBFGS 12456. The AI began its welcome speech in an automated manner. "I'm the AI who has been assigned to your group. As this is your first time in an Oracle City, I'm here to inform you of the rules of conduct and answer any questions you may have." She? Couldn't you answer these questions instead? You two are considered Oracle AIs, right? Jake questioned his own AI instead, ignoring the drone addressing them for the moment. Kyle and Tim, on the other hand, enthusiastically started communicating with the drone. They seemed to be science fiction fanatics. So was Jake, but he wasn't the type to get excited about something he'd seen before. The problem was Crunch, who had decided that the drone looked very similar to the ball he liked to play with. The drone nevertheless showed remarkable composure, silently avoiding every sneaky paw swing of the cat, without stopping for a second to answer questions. "I can," she confirmed with a snort. "It's just an attempt by the Oracle to glean a little more ether. The drone should be trying to sell you something soon." Unsurprisingly, that's exactly what happened. After briefly explaining the city's living rules not to kill, steal, or harm the holders of Oracle devices, the drone did attempt to sell them an item. The official language of the mirror universe is a must if you want to be able to communicate and navigate easily in an oracle city. Unfortunately, it's an extremely complex language because it has to be able to express the nuances and concepts of each race. You can acquire the knowledge of this language in the Oracle store for the price of a certain amount of ether, but in the meantime, you can use one of our universal translators. They will allow you to communicate with any species, regardless of your language and mode of communication. Do you want to use one of our translators? Decline, she shouted without hesitation. Rather trusting his AI, Jake turned down the offer. Kyle was the only one who accepted, but more out of curiosity. Do you want to buy one of our universal translators, or just borrow it? Could I know the prices beforehand? The playboy asked out of precaution. He was curious, not naive. Since this is your first time in an oracle city, the permanent purchase of a translator will cost you 10,000 units of ether. If you just want to borrow one, it will cost you 10 ether units per day. Well, no thanks. Kyle almost cried. Just out of curiosity, how much does it normally cost for a translator? 100,000 units of ether. Fuck. They all swore at the same time, even Tim. Chapter 153, The Rules Loopholes. Do you understand the universal language of the mirror universe? Jake tried his luck, although he was not very optimistic. I can read the light engravings on the buildings in the distance, but if I try to write or speak in this language, it's a black hole. She sighed after trying for a few seconds. I think my memories are still locked. She didn't speak English originally, so it's probably one of the aspects of my memory that the Oracle system has tampered. Never mind, we tried. Jake consoled her as best he could when he noticed the AI's distress. It's just one more language to learn. I'm a genius now. It shouldn't be that hard. Who are you talking to, Jake? Sarah, who was standing next to him, suddenly asked him. Upon hearing her question, he realized he'd been talking out loud without realizing it. He then remembered that his companions also had an AI like his with their own personalities. He wondered if all Oracle A's were similar or if she was special. My Oracle AI. I was checking to see if she could act as a translator, but she can too. Jake replied succinctly. Sarah's eyes opened slightly out of surprise. So did Will, who was following the conversation beside them. Your Oracle AI is a woman, Will exclaimed with an envious look. Mine has the voice of an absolutely unbearable auto-tune robot. His original body was an android. What? Original body? Kyle, who had decided to ignore the drone for good, joined the conversation. Don't you ever talk to your AI? Sarah taunted him with a raised, annoyed eyebrow. Our AIs are the duplicate consciousnesses of real individuals who have existed or still exist in the mirror universe. I thought you already knew that by now. Kyle was speechless at the revelation, his jaw so open it could drop at any moment. A dentist would have appreciated attending to a patient like that. Does this mean I have a chance to meet Vea someday? Awesome. Seeing his exuberance, the rest of the group facepalmed themselves, deciding to pretend they didn't know him while Jake walked straight to the city. The ground was extremely sleek and of the same carbon gray color as the mysterious buildings they were heading towards. It looked like a huge slab with a few Legos added on top. In the end, Tim was by far the quietest, just following him closely. His mother's death, which for them was already a few months old, seemed like ancient history to him. He did not behave at all like a 5-year-old child who would have grown up in a hurry. His maturity was consistent with that of a teenager his age. This confirmed two things. His ordeal had lasted a few years, and the world he had been sent to was different from his own. Otherwise, by the time Jake had met the digesters, he would have been sent back along with them. Clearly, his ordeal had not been affected by his ill-fated encounter. As they were making steady progress, the group passed all sorts of makeshift camps. The poverty and fatigue of most of the survivors was apparent. In the absence of toilets as well as sewage and garbage disposal routes, the smell of excrement, urine, and sweat was ever present. With its high perception, it was a real torment. Many of the refugees were lethargic, just sleeping or sitting, but others were more vigorous, using every means available to relieve their stress. Whether animals, humans, or aliens, cries of fornication, more or less ecstatic or consensual, could be heard everywhere. Of course, he did not pretend to be able to interpret the meaning of the noises emitted by unknown species and even less to know all the modes of reproduction existing in the mirror universe, and whether they were a source of pleasure or not. Jake had not missed the loopholes in the Oracle City's rules of conduct. It was forbidden to steal, injure, or kill, but there were plenty of other ways to harm someone without breaking those rules, and some people had already figured that out. For example, it was possible to manipulate or extort someone without causing physical injury by using aphrodisiacs, sleeping pills, or simply threatening, blackmailing, or coercion. The level of flexibility of the rules remained to be determined, but if there were only Ace like this drone to ensure their proper enforcement, he was not very hopeful. It was clear that the aliens, animals, and humans camped in droves around the various cubes and structures had not yet participated in their first ordeal. In addition to being exhausted, their faces were often terrified and haggard as if their minds were too narrow to handle so much change in such a short time. A player, even a bad one who failed his ordeal, was comparatively more stable. Because the ordeal had lasted a long time, they were no longer in shock about their arrival in the mirror universe. This did not mean that they were relaxed or rested, but they were not overwhelmed by the events. The key point was that these players were generally not so limited in ether. If it was possible not to fight at all during an ordeal, they had necessarily gained something from it, either through their new stats or their rewards. Moreover, a player was rarely alone when joining a red cube. After months of ordeal together, most players had formed bonds in groups or factions eventually formed. This was the reason why Jake had a relative trust in Will, Kyle, and Sarah. He wouldn't trust them with his life, far from it, but he had a good idea of their mentality and what they were capable of. In any case, being in good company was always better than wandering alone in a hostile world where factions of all races were growing at breakneck speed. After passing through a belt of tents, blankets, and campfires, they finally arrived at the foot of the large carbon gray structures with their various geometric shapes. With no walls or guards, Jake wondered why no one had set up camp directly in the city, but he got his answer immediately when he was stopped by an invisible force field. At that moment, a new notification from the Oracle system resounded in his mind, informing him that he had to pay another fee to enter the city walls. This time the price was set at 5 ether points. Jake gnashed his teeth when he read the notification, but he still agreed to pay. After killing a few flying digesters, he was back up to 200 points in sum, but that could be gone very quickly considering the price of a simple translator. The drone that had welcomed them had long ago abandoned them to take care of other newcomers. In fact, during their few minutes' walk to the city, dozens of other aliens had in turn appeared on the black cube's edge. As he squinted at them, Jake recognized the humanoid alien with dendrites instead of hair among the newcomers. He hadn't forgotten the plasma blast it had fired to bring down a huge digester. Even after being buried by an avalanche of digesters, the alien was unharmed. Its black metal armor was still intact. Not even the silvery blood of its victims could taint it. Its posture was as arrogant as it was provocative, and even when faced with the drone trying to talk to it, Jake could see the creature's fists opening and closing unintentionally, as if it was barely holding back from pulverizing the machine with a punch. In any case, however powerful this alien may be, he would have to bend to the rules of the Oracle as well, so for now they had nothing to fear. Jake checked whether everyone had enough ether to get through the force field, and when he saw that they did, he set off again. Unsure, they decided to go to the largest structure, which was a sort of huge cylinder near the center of the city, about 50 meters in diameter and higher than the tallest skyscrapers on Earth. When they arrived in front of it, the group contemplated the structure in search of a way in. Jake scrutinized, then touched the light symbols inscribed all over the surface of the structure, but no notification of the system popped out. Can you read these symbols? Jake asked tentatively. I can. It says, The Oracle Playground. Chapter 154, The Oracle Playground. Jake wasn't sure if it was the right place to visit first, but now that they were out front, they could afford to take a look. As long as he didn't have ether to spend, it wouldn't bother him. How do I get in? Jake asked in his mind. Just like the other cubes. By walking through it. If you're in doubt, simple physical contact should give you the answer. She answered calmly. Impossible. I've already touched the symbols on the wall. Jake replied, frowning confusedly. But you weren't trying to get in. Try again with the intention of entering the building. Okay, I'll test that. Following Shi's advice, he put his hand against the carbon gray surface again, and this time a notification from the system asked him if he wished to enter. For once, and to his great satisfaction, no ether was charged. When Jake agreed, part of the smooth surface of the wall in front of him began to swirl and liquefy in front of him, quickly forming a vortex of liquid metal approximately his size. Realizing it was the equivalent of a door, he walked towards it, disappearing inside, as in a stargate. Indoors, a vast space much more attractive than the outside revealed itself before his eyes. At last, he had the impression of finally returning to the shopping malls he was used to, but more futuristic. The carbon gray metal still made up all the walls and furniture, but a very different atmosphere resulted from it. In the huge hall in which it was located, which was larger than an airport terminal, dozens of wide corridors were connected. Signs covered with symbols in the language of the mirror universe preceded them. Behind them were very different, much less artificial settings. This gave the impression of a complete change of atmosphere and culture. In general, the Oracle Playground seemed to be a patchwork of different leisure places with their own characteristics, depending on the purpose and target species. Some spaces seemed mixed while others seemed to be reserved for certain types of species or individuals only. The place was so large that it was impossible to see its limits, not to mention the countless elevators and stairs leading to the upper floors. Like the Black Cube, these buildings seemed to be equipped with a space technology that could greatly increase the size of the interior. Every 10 or 15 meters, a terminal resembling a metal sausage with a blue light vein was planted in the ground, waiting to be consulted. Spherical drones like the ones that had hosted them were also floating around, sometimes static, sometimes shooting at full speed while carrying something, often a blue or silver cube. Touch one of these posts. There should be a map of the complex available. Listening to her instructions, Jake walked up to one of those metal blocks and put his hand on it. A map was then projected directly into his mind, and all he had to do was focus on one place to get information on the subject. Unfortunately, it was still in the mysterious mirror universe language that he didn't understand yet. She, can you understand it? Give me a moment. Meanwhile, the rest of his group had also entered the building through the vortex that Jake had used to get in. Even his cat eventually caught up with him, although it took the reassuring petting of Sarah and Tim to convince him to enter the vortex. To Crunch, although his intelligence had improved significantly, the vortex was like a wall. Seeing them disappear one by one didn't comfort him despite the fact that his own shadow guide showed no hesitation in following them. Each of them eventually joined another terminal like Jake, listening to their oracle A's for more information. As she translated the symbols she recognized, or at least was allowed to remember, the symbols on his mental map were gradually replaced by the English he was familiar with. It turned out that the Oracle Playground was compartmentalized by species, but also by Oracle rank. There were public spaces that everyone could go to, but others were reserved for a restricted audience. Locating the area reserved for humanoids on his map, he also found by zooming in another subsection for humans. The term human in the mirror universe, which had a slightly different meaning, encompassed species with very similar physical appearances and capable of communicating with their vocal cords. In practice, their genetics and internal structure could be very different, such as having 3 hearts, the digestive system of an insect, or the ability to change shape. In any case, if a species could adopt a human form or come close to it, it could enter. Even then, some places were not accessible to all humans. As with a truck exceeding a certain height in a tunnel, there were also size limits to be respected, and areas reserved for giants or dwarf races also existed. On this point, the Oracle's organization was impressive, as it seemed to have planned enough to accommodate virtually every possible species. The hall they were in was rather empty except for a few aliens passing by here and there. Jake didn't intend to open his horizons by chatting with other aliens, so he took a big step towards the section reserved for humans, Crunch on his heels. Thanks to his pet contract, he was considered Jake's property and could thus accompany him. However, any infraction committed by the cat would be the responsibility of its owner, and just for that reason alone Jake would not let the cat out of his sight for more than a few seconds. Will, Sarah, Kyle, and Tim joined him shortly afterwards, equally excited to finally meet other humans in a safe place. With a little luck, they could even find people they knew. even if the probability was extremely low. The group crossed the corridor leading to the humanoid section, which then led them to another hall where orange cubes of various sizes were waiting for them, levitating slightly above the ground. Following their map, they entered one of the cubes of their size after accepting the system's notification. They reappeared a fraction of a second later on another floor in the middle of a plaza around which a sort of mini-city had been erected. The sky was a cloudless blue, but was different from place to place, reminding them that it was actually a ceiling on which an image was projected. The plaza was paved with polished stones, just like the roads, with a fountain in the middle. Gardens and parks were visible nearby, with wooden benches at regular intervals. Hotels, houses, and other villas with different architectures occupied a good part of this human recreational town, the rest being dedicated to leisure facilities. There was everything from sports complexes, swimming pools, a cinema, theater, casino, bars and restaurants, a brothel, and even an amusement park. More traditional shops offered a variety of objects and foods from their home planets, but for the time being, human-shaped drones were used as vendors. With their blue light veined metal bodies and the blue cubes behind them, Jake had no doubt that the prices would be exorbitant. Once again, he wasn't disappointed. In a kind of bakery where human pastries from the entire mirror universe were available, he discovered by consulting the drone that a simple apple pie cost 10 ether points. Jake understood Aslael's words better when he explained that all transactions in the mirror universe were done using ether. Indeed, if a normal civilian hoped to survive peacefully in an Oracle city, he would need a stable supply of ether. By refusing to participate in ordeals or kill digesters, it was almost impossible. He did notice, however, that most of the shops were empty and available for sale, as were most of the residences. Instead of stupidly buying a pizza for 20 ether points, there was probably a profit to be made for the one who would open his own pizzeria. However, to do so, you still had to get the ingredients. There was the equivalent of a supermarket, but Jake realized with surprise that the prices in ether were very close to the dishes and pastries made and sold by the Oracle drones. The profit margin by cooking the ingredients sold by the system was too low. But more importantly, to have a chance, you needed customers. And for the time being, the Oracle playground in this Oracle city was appallingly empty. Since their arrival in the center of the plaza, the group hadn't met anyone. Chapter 155 Unexpected Encounter. Jake may have been curious, but he couldn't wait to find a place where he could settle down out of sight and finally check out his rewards. When he opened his backpack to retrieve a rope to descend the cliff, he caught a glimpse of two blue cubes of the size of a Rubik's Cube inside that looked just like the ones the drones kept carrying around in a hurry. To be quite honest, they had come across quite a few cubes of all kinds of colors since their arrival on B842, but especially since their entry into the Oracle City. Just outside the Oracle playground, they had seen other cubes as big as the red cube in which they had made their ordeal. Notably, two huge green and blue cubes respectively, as well as an even more massive yellow cube in the heart of the city. Even within the Oracle playground, smaller orange cubes seemed to act as teleporters inside the building, and a large yellow cube about 10 meters tall stood atop a skyscraper that they could see from their position. At first they thought they had reached the central plaza of the city, but after acclimatizing to the place, they soon noticed the other similar plazas nearby. The plaza and the orange cube that had brought them there were currently on the perimeter of a circle marking the outer boundary of the city. On this paved road around the city, other plazas were visible every 50 meters, each with its own orange cube. Although they thought the city was completely uninhabited at first, they soon saw other humans materializing not far from them on the adjacent paved plazas. When Kyle saw other humans, he was tempted to approach them to gather information, but Jake held his arm back as he noticed their style of dress and appearance. In addition to wearing strange, spongy-looking armor, each of them was almost 10 feet tall, which was probably close to the size limit allowed in this location. We'll have plenty of time to make friends with all these aliens, but for now we're just here to familiarize ourselves with the place. Jake called the shots. We can spread out if you want. I'll be back in front of that cube in half an hour. The group discussed among themselves for a few minutes, but all agreed. In principle, they were safe as long as they did not try anything suspicious. Many Oracle drones were actively monitoring the area, and there were no dark or unfamiliar alleys. As a leisure town, It was a place reserved for wealthy players and evolvers, so there was little chance of anyone breaking the rules. When in doubt, it was best to walk around in pairs. She confirmed to him that they could communicate without any problem via their wristbands, but that remote communications cost ether and the range was limited to about 10 times that of the scan. For Jake, who was sergeant, this meant that he could contact his group members up to 500 meters away without any problem, the scan being limited to 50 meters. It wasn't miraculous, but it was a start. Sarah agreed to go for a walk with Kyle, while Will and Tim formed another pair. The first duo was in good shape and could square the city much faster than Will and Tim, whose stats were more modest. As for Jake, he could cover the city in a few minutes, and it was much more efficient for him to be on his own. If one of them found something interesting, they could try to contact each other via their bracelets or wait until they got back to the plaza to let them know. Having no idea of Crunch's real physical level, he decided to let him follow Will and Tim, with whom he got along well. His behavior was excellent for the moment. Perhaps not yet as intelligent as a human, but he understood the instructions he was given relatively well if the movements were explicit enough. The other advantage was that apparently because of his pet contract, Jake could always feel the direction his cat was moving in. This was a hidden feature that seemed to have been activated only after their ordeal was over. Since Jake hadn't done anything special, it was a good bet that this change was either related to his Oracle rank or a reward that Crunch had gotten for himself that benefited both of them. Wishing each other well, the group split up, Jake, Sarah, and Kyle leaving Will and Tim behind in an instant. Sarah and Kyle turned left at the first intersection, while Jake headed straight towards the heart of the city. Fortunately, the paved roads were wide, and there were no living souls, because at the speed he was traveling, a collision would have been fatal to a normal human. A car would probably have been slightly lifted off the ground by the impact, its bodywork totally deformed. In this case, Jake would have suffered slight bruises or bumps, but nothing he couldn't heal in a few hours. The polished white stones on the roads were definitely special. The ground was neither damaged nor heated by Jake's passage, but sadly this was not the case for his boots. Since his return from the Red Cube, his maximum speed had far exceeded the physical limits of an Earthman, and the direct consequence was that his soles were completely dead. A little more, and we would probably see his toes sticking out. Slowing down to preserve what little was left, Jake sighed with lassitude. Getting clothes that could hold up was another of his concerns, to which he had to find a solution, or he might well spend his future on B-842 naked. He stopped for a short while in front of a clothing shop run by a drone, but boots his size capable of withstanding subsonic friction cost, unsurprisingly, several thousand ether points. For even higher quality, the prices rose dramatically. Fuck, how am I supposed to pay for all this? Jake grumbled in a bad mood. You could learn to sew? I'm just saying. She laughed. Jake's face suddenly lit up. That I can do, but I need a material strong enough to hold it, and something to work it with. Jake realized for the first time that his AI was capable of laughing, which had the immediate effect of making him forget his precariousness. To every problem, there was a solution. At worst, he'd go out and shoot up some digesters to fill up on ether. For now, you can control your yellow ether constitution to focus on your boots. She patiently reminded him. But that means your body will be weakened and unable to withstand your speed in terms of either endurance or stamina. Jake grunted in response. He had already thought of this solution, but finding an ideal balance in his distribution of ether meant becoming considerably slower. It was a compromise he refused to make. If he had to walk barefoot, so be it. Minutes later, he finally reached the heart of the city, the skyscraper with a tall yellow cube towering over it. For the first time outside the border plazas, there were people. In addition to the skyscraper in the center, there were a dozen other orange cubes around at regular intervals, much more massive than the human-sized ones by which he had been teleported here. Numerous restaurants and other large buildings that looked like hotels or real estate agencies surrounded the main square. Many of these restaurants had open-air terraces or tables extending directly onto the plaza. A few groups of humans of all finery and appearance occupied these tables, devouring with appetite dishes costing dozens of ether points. Scanning the terraces and balconies with his eyes, Jake's attention was caught by two individuals eating at one table. A white man and a black woman. Both had very short, nearly shaved hair and a morose expression. What caught his attention was neither their deep-fried coca burger menu costing dozens of precious ether points, nor the huge swords leaning against the table beside them, but rather their uniforms. It had been a long time since Jake had seen a similar one, and even if this one was quite different, he would have recognized the coat of arms on their shoulder even after decades. On a rectangular patch with a black background, a blue sphere with green spots was painted on it, the Earth. Chapter 156, The Floating Islands. Military members of the Earth government. They no longer wore the colorful green or khaki outfits designed to facilitate camouflage, but black uniforms with several pieces of armor protecting their vital points. They wore an assault rifle slung across their shoulders and a gun on their belts, but their design was somewhat different, although he was by no means a specialist in this field. Considering the size of the planet, the likelihood of encountering Earth military personnel was incredibly low. If he squandered that opportunity, he'd be a complete moron. As he walked towards them, he tried to contact his other companions, but they were out of range. "Excuse me, mind if I sit down here with you?" Jake asked politely in English. To their gloomy expressions, they were clearly not new recruits. To eat a dish in this restaurant, they either had to be very stupid or be much richer in ether than he was right now. The duo stopped eating for a moment to inspect the newcomer. Their grumpy faces lit up as soon as they saw him, the man literally bursting into laughter. "At last, we found a Earthling. 3 weeks we've been waiting in this godforsaken hole. I couldn't take it anymore. I must have gained 2 or 3 pounds from eating all that junk food," the young woman added with a relieved tone while continuing to dip her fries in a pot of ketchup. Jake was stunned to see their reaction, far from the seriousness of the army he had expected. "Sit at our table, no manners with us," the man exclaimed, pointing to the chair in front of him. Their exuberance turned the heads of a few humans who were eating silently beside them, but because they were from another planet, they could not understand anything and therefore lost interest just as quickly. "My name is Patrick, Sergeant Chief of the Earth Army, and she is Alima, of the same rank." The soldier introduced him and his colleague in a jovial tone. "We're here to liaise with the Earth government and secondarily to recruit or safeguard the Earthlings who come here." Jake was interested in the goals of their mission, but he had no confidence in the government. After all, the government had preferred to sacrifice all non-essential personnel by warning humanity at the last moment. As for the disappearance of the Earth, the uninvolved humans had discovered it on their own at their expense. Even if he understood such a silence in order to avoid mass panic and riots, it was still extremely petty and immoral. "My name is Jake. To be honest, I'm not really interested in joining the government at the moment. What's in it for me?" "To tell you the truth, not much." Alima sneered with her mouth full of her hamburger. "The government doesn't really have a proper structure now. The president is struggling to rally authority around him. A few evolvers and players who were originally just soldiers have already become powerful enough to form their own factions. They still obey the government on paper, but in practice we have no control over them. It's not all bad, though," Patrick completed by raising his plate. "With the material resources and technology at Earth's disposal, we've still managed to accumulate a lot of ether and a comfortable position on Thelma. The government has even secured one of the floating islands orbiting B842. "Thelma? Floating islands?" Jake repeated with confusion. "Oh, I forgot you just got here, burp. Oh God, my bloating's coming back." The soldier remembered, burping after a sip of Coke. "The black cube you came from is an oracle shelter," Alima explained in his place. "They call them oracle cities, but that's an abuse of language. Aside from the limited infrastructure provided by the oracle system, there's not much else. Refugees accumulate there without being able to pay the ether taxes and form shanties and slums outside of the force field where the oracle cubes and other oracle buildings are located. These facilities, like the oracle playground, are connected to each other and form a network through the various orange cubes. The orange cube in each plaza here leads to a different oracle shelter. There are about 100 plazas around the city where we are, so there are 100 different oracle shelters connected to this place. The place where we are may be considered an oracle city, but there are bigger ones. By borrowing the big orange cubes around the skyscraper next door, you can join other nearby oracle playground cities for 50 points of ether or even other infrastructures of the same level to avoid wasting time each time by going back to your oracle shelter to change buildings. If you pay 500 ether points, you can use the yellow cube and reach Thelma. But it's expensive even for us, so we don't go there often. Thelma can be considered the Oracle capital. Governments and big names of all species capable enough have formed their own base, and it is even possible to meet the Oracle overseer up there. Jake effortlessly digested this new information, but even with his newfound intelligence, he couldn't help but be impressed. He felt like a microbe in the middle of a world so vast that he could hardly grasp its limits. What about those floating islands? Jake picked up on the subject, trying to conserve his composure. Though he was shaken, he had no intention of showing it. Thelma is a floating island, the largest of them all at the moment, but there are plenty more around B842, orbiting hundreds of miles or more. Patrick, who had finally finished his meal, took over and explained the rest to him. With a Tier 6 Oracle rank and the player status, it is possible to buy one of these islands, but I don't know all the details. All I know is that they are artificially created by the Oracle and the number of completed ordeals is large. You can customize them any way you want, even enlarge them. They say that when Earth Government Island was first created, it was no bigger than a football field. Now, we should be able to fit the United Kingdom in there. Why not directly monopolize a few Oracle shelters or build a base in a suitable location right on the planet's surface? Jake interrupted him, not convinced these islands were worth the investment. If they were to be expanded directly through the Oracle system, it would probably cost a fortune just to extend it a few meters. We've tried that in the past, Alima admitted with a stern face. But none of those bases held. As soon as too many intelligent life forms concentrate in one place, the digesters show up. The more powerful the warriors are, the more ether they have, and the more they attract ether to them. In other words, the better the defense of our base, the brighter we shine, which attracts the high-ranking digesters like shit draws flies. At least on one of these islands, we can control the elimination of the digesters as soon as they spawn from the atmosphere. And by installing a black cube, it's possible to mask the ether signature of its inhabitants, which is the only known way to develop in peace. What about the Oracle shelters? Jake asked. We partially control a few, but there are too many and the prices in ether are too high. The two soldiers sighed long and hard. It's hard to get enough humans in there, and there's not enough space to grow anything. Even if we try to grow crops outside, then the other aliens steal our crops, and if we post our evolvers and high-level players to defend them, the digesters will show up right away. Most importantly, it's impossible to ban entry into an Oracle shelter because violence is forbidden. If you use one of the orange cubes present, you can join any one of them, and no one will be able to stop you. The true masters of Oracle shelters and cities are the Oracle drones. Jake remained silent for a long time after that, meditating on what he had just learned. With no faction or organization to manage, government issues weren't really his concern. If he could buy or build a mansion with everything he needed, he would probably be satisfied. His intuition, however, was that these islands were important, because Jake was also convinced that the black cubes could be purchased directly from the Oracle store. So building an undetectable base directly on the planet wasn't really impossible. This meant that the black cubes were not so invincible, and therefore the security of the Oracle shelters relied more on its drones than on its cube. In this case, how were these floating islands different? They may have been floating, but given the speed at which these creatures evolve, there must have been a bunch of them capable of flying at that altitude. Without Oracle drones, these islands were pretty much indefensible in the event of an attack. As he checked the time, he realized that the moment he was supposed to meet up with his group was almost upon him. He would have to put the rest of this conversation off for another day. Chapter 157 Business Opportunities. Sorry, I gotta go. Jake apologized abruptly as he got up. We made a schedule with the rest of my group to meet at the plaza where we appeared. Oh, no worries. I completely understand. Patrick accepted his apology with an understanding smile. As he wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his uniform, he added, Do you mind if we come with you? We're off duty at the moment. We can explain the rest to you on the way. Jake pondered for a moment and then nodded, thinking it was a bargain. The two soldiers were good company and were a mine of free information. Only the Oracle knew how long and how much ether the information would have cost him if he had had to get it alone. Alima had also finished eating, but more graceful than her colleague. She rinsed her hands and face at the nearby fountain. Once ready, Jake set off again towards the orange cube he had come by. In less than a minute, the trio covered the 3-4 kilometers in a straight line separating them from the plaza. Although he had expected it, he was still somewhat impressed to see the two soldiers following his pace effortlessly. What made him jealous, in particular, was that their black leather boots were not deteriorating, unlike his own, which had reached a dangerously alarming level of wear and tear. Is it the government that provides all your equipment, or do you have to buy it yourself? Jake asked curiously when he saw that they were a bit ahead of the rest of his group. Alima and Patrick glanced at his boots and chuckled in amusement. Nevertheless, they answered him frankly without the slightest condescension. After all, they had been there too. The government provides the uniform for the players and evolvers working for them, but the quality differs greatly from one soldier to another. It must cost a fortune, right? Jake had a hard time understanding how the government could spend so much ether on his army if the most powerful players and evolvers were already out of control. Yes and no, Alima answered, guessing his reasoning. Except for the richest evolvers, nobody buys their equipment or anything really expensive directly from the Oracle store. Every blue cube in the shops here is a kiosk giving access to the Oracle store. Even if a human ran the store instead of a drone, the prices would be the same. The drone simply prevents scams. In this case, the government has what it takes to make them. Jake concluded aloud. So, how does it solve the problem of raw materials? Even using the Earth's resources before, there are limits to what it can do. That's where our role comes in, Patrick continued, pulling a piece of gum out of nowhere. The normal military on the flying island, which is called New Earth by the way, is not much different from the humans being transported on B-842 for the first time. With the exception of their training and firearms, their role is limited to ensuring the safety of the island or monitoring the transport cubes in the Oracle shelters. However, with sufficient manpower and adequate firepower, it is still possible for the government to accumulate resources. An airstrike of missiles or a nuke on a horde of digesters or low-level creatures is enough to ensure a steady stream of ether. A senior officer will then retrieve the ether and return it to a key government official for reinvestment. If they want the remains in good condition for furs, skins, or bones, they send evolvers like us. We can keep the ether for ourselves, but the materials must be returned for contribution points. We get paid in ether and contribution points based on the quality of what we bring back to HQ. Our equipment is designed largely from these materials by the Science and Research Department, and we can use our contribution points to get equipment. These lab rats are overly arrogant, but they're doing a good job. You've got to give them credit for that. Hearing their explanation, Jake was even more reluctant to join the army. He had never really had the soul of a patriot, and his first feeling was that without New Earth, the government would probably have collapsed. Having equipment benefits or a guaranteed salary in ether was certainly pleasant, but the fact that they couldn't leave New Earth or the Oracle shelter without permission was a real deterrent, which would slow down their progress considerably. At that moment, a mass of hair as hard as thorns snuggled up against his leg, tearing his pants even more. Jake was really starting to look like a vagrant with holes in his boots and ragged pants. Fuck off, Crunch. Jake grabbed the mastiff-sized black cat by the neck, giving the two soldiers present a rather ridiculous view. Unless you've got enough ether to buy me more clothes, I suggest you stop that. Uffed. Alima burst out laughing, while Patrick nearly choked on his gum, which almost got down the wrong way. Tim and Will arrived shortly afterwards, jogging along and suspiciously staring at the two strangers. Recognizing the crest on their uniforms, Will relaxed visibly. With Jake's introduction, the former businessman eagerly shook their hands as if he was about to close a great deal. Kyle and Sarah joined them a few seconds later with a look of frustration. After the two soldiers introduced themselves again, Kyle began to rant and rave in an outraged tone. We saw Amy. The bitch wouldn't even talk, claiming she was busy. My ass is busy. Jake raised an questioning eyebrow. Sarah shrugged, explaining the situation in an awkward tone. Cho Minho asked her to give him a report on the Oracle playground by the end of the day. She was to list the various prices of real estate sales and rentals, each shop and the prices charged depending on whether it was occupied by Oracle drone or not, as well as any profit opportunities she might have found. She said this is a test that Minho gave her and that she must absolutely fulfill her mission to prove her worth. I swear this bitch had hearts in her eyes at that moment. Kyle, who was still spitting out his venom, sneered. All right, calm down. Amy's free to do whatever she wants. Will mediated as he patted the shoulder of the playboy whose ego seemed to have taken a hit. This Cho Min-ho is a formidable businessman. If he gave this assignment to Amy instead of handling it in person, it's probably a test indeed. He's already starting to cultivate his trustworthy men and women, I see. Jake nodded to show he felt the same way. He agreed with Will. That was the advantage of big corporations. They could easily divide up the work. The Korean was certainly active somewhere else, as were most of his promising new hires. For Jake, on the other hand, it wasn't very good news. This Oracle playground was still sparsely populated due to the high ether fees to get into the heart of the shelter, but it would soon fill up as new players and evolvers joined the shelters. Cho Min-ho, that sounds familiar. Alima whispered, scratching her chin pensively. Oh, I remember, Cho Industries. They're fucking rich. Were, Patrick added. If he's here on his own, it means his family knew nothing about the whole truth behind the mirror universe. They must be completely scattered all over the planet right now. He has his 2 bodyguards with him, that's all I know. Jake said, not really concerned. In that case, if every Kicho member is protected, they have a chance of reforming provided those bodyguards are loyal. The most important thing in the beginning is to survive and accumulate ether. After that, like everywhere else, you have to manage your ether and invest. That's why violence and theft are forbidden in the Oracle cities, to allow these business-minded civilians to prosper and thrive. As Will heard those last words, a spark went through his eyes. Finally, he may have a chance to shine. As for Jake, even though he knew nothing about business, he didn't intend to get stepped on, either. As with Bitcoin a century earlier, anyone who had bought some in the early days of cryptocurrency for a few dollars had made millions a few years later. The situation was the same today on B842. First come, first served. Chapter 158, The Pyramid. Now that everyone had arrived, there was no reason for them to stay here any longer. Jake and the rest of the group borrowed the orange cube they had come in, and then retraced their steps back to the lobby of the Oracle playground. On the way out, Jake ran into Enya, the pink-haired young woman, followed by another group of nobles and a few bodyguards. Once again, she was surprised to run into him twice in such a short time, not to mention the fact that his group had arrived before them, but she didn't mind. After all, their mobility was rather limited because of the civilians they were protecting. Choosing to mind his own business, Jake ignored them, even though Will, in a teasing mood, winked at the lady. Sarah rolled her eyes when she saw his flirtation attempt, but Kyle also seemed tempted to do the same. After all, a second pink-haired beauty, looking just like her, was standing beside the young woman. Probably her sister or a cousin. There were enough for both of them. As the saying goes, caring is sharing. Patrick and Alima took one look at the troop of humans dressed in medieval clothing and armor, but they lost interest when they realized they weren't from Earth. In the mirror universe, most of the human species generally stick together, followed by the humanoid species on a larger scale, but this was by no means guaranteed. At least when it came to controlling an Oracle city or an Oracle playground, the competition was as fierce as between 2 countries at war. Most of the time, the most technologically advanced civilization would take control of the shelter, since violence was forbidden, but it was not always the case. What should we visit first when we enter an Oracle shelter for the first time? Jake questioned the 2 soldiers once outside. The 2 soldiers were surprised for a while when they saw the clouds full of red lightning, but they quickly regained their composure. As they watched the tens of thousands of refugees gathering outside the force field, they saluted the chance they had been given to enter B842 in advance. It depends on your priorities. Alima replied. If you want a job, you can sign up for missions halls. There are 2 of them, the regular one and the Oracle Mission Hall. The first is for jobs and assignments given by other evolvers, while the second is for assignments given directly by the Oracle. Whichever hall you go to, there should be an Earth military officer on duty ready to receive you there. None of them wanted to work or risk their lives right now. They just wanted to get information and rest after their ordeal. Jake was no different. He wanted some peace and quiet to check his rewards and take stock of his situation. Or else, there's the civilian, evolver, and Player Hall if you want to meet people who match you or register a faction, guild, or business. There's the Oracle Bank if you want to protect your possessions or ether crystals. Patrick added, seeing as they didn't seem to be too excited. Right now we just want to rest, I guess. Jake apologized with a sorry smile. Is there a cheap solution that would keep us from pitching our tents in the middle of the dump outside? Oh yes, of course. Follow me. I'll show you. Patrick beckoned them to follow him. In a few short strides, he led them to a huge carbon gray pyramid, not much smaller than the cylinder forming the Oracle playground. Without hesitation, the soldier entered the pyramid, disappearing into another vortex of liquid metal. Alima entered after her colleague, with Jake's group following close behind. The inside presented them with a very different entrance hall than the one in the Oracle playground. Once again, there were posts and counters manned by drones. However, the environment was as stark as it could be. Floor, wall, and ceiling were covered with dark metal, and hundreds of corridors were spreading out in all directions. Orange cubes were visible at regular intervals, and symbols were visible along the corridor walls. A single yellow cube was towering in the very middle of the hall. Welcome to the Oracle Bunker. It's a bit like a boat cabin when you're not used to it, but you won't find anything cheaper, and it's customizable at will. Patrick said proudly, even if everything else goes wrong, your cabin will still be there. The rest of the group listened carefully to the rest of his explanations and concluded that indeed they would not find anything better. The prices of the Oracle Playground residences were simply unaffordable at the moment, and privacy was not really granted since only violence and theft was condemned. Beginning to get familiar with the process, Jake let she translate the map presented by the digital kiosk. Once done, he was finally able to choose a booth matching the size of his purse. It was relatively simple. The Oracle loved binary. He'd already realized this with the price of the different types of ether. For every additional 10 square meters of space, the cost in ether per day doubled. To buy it permanently, you had to multiply the price by 1,000. An evolver could only own one cabin. It was the Oracle's logical countermeasure to keep everyone from renting multiple cabins at low prices. The good thing, however, was that it was easy to get into them no matter what Oracle shelter or city you were in. The good news was that 10 square meters only cost 1 point of ether per day. Even if he decided to hide inside the Oracle shelter without doing anything, he could hold on to his reserves for a few months without any problem. Of course, this did not take into account the cost of living within the black cube. The problem was that to add furniture, a toilet, a shower, or a faucet, you had to pay extra. Simply adding a shower and toilet added 10 extra points per day, and immediately it was not as customer-friendly. Nevertheless, Jake agreed to pay. In the end, he selected a 20 square meter cabin with toilet and shower for 12 ether points per day. He didn't intend to twiddle his thumbs. As soon as he figured out his strategy, he would take action. And if he had to take a risk by leaving the shelter to replenish his ether, he wouldn't hesitate. The group bid farewell to the two soldiers, who informed them that they would be waiting for them at the mission hall if they wanted to join the government or just needed help finding work. On this point, it had to be admitted that the Earth government had done a good job posting military personnel in most of the Oracle cities and playgrounds. Not all alien species could say the same. Jake then walked with his cat to the custom booth he had chosen. If he was just a normal human, he would have probably gotten lost in the pyramid. By borrowing the yellow cube, it was possible to reach his cabin by paying 50 points of ether, but the best was to borrow the orange cubes, which were free. The only problem was that you had to use quite a number of them to reach the cabin of your choice, each time choosing among multiple destinations with long series of symbols and numbers. A normal human would have been lost after a few teleports without the help of his AI. Fortunately, Jake's intelligence had not been enhanced for nothing. Even after having used 100 orange cubes in a row, meandering from one corridor to another, he still remembered his way back perfectly. Crunch had complete confidence in his master, letting himself be carried from one cube to the next without batting an eyelid. Momentarily, Jake freaked out when he became aware that his booth had no litter box, but relaxed instantly when he remembered that Crunch knew how to use the toilet. His only problem was that the cat was now much bigger. A feline the size of a big dog sitting on a toilet bowl was going to be quite a sight, not to mention the smell. When he thought of this major concern, Jake's face fell, and he stopped abruptly to look for a post or drone nearby. Luckily, there were plenty of them everywhere. Connecting his bracelet to his cats, he managed to use his authority as owner via the pet contract to reserve a second booth, which in addition could be directly connected through one of those vortex gates. There were two advantages resulting from this action. First, he was able to double the space in his booth for cheap, since it legally belonged to his cat. And secondly, he realized that his cat was rich. Chapter 159 Finally Quiet. His cat's status was as follows. Species, Himalayan Persian cat. Height, 88 centimeters. Weight, 82 kilograms. Oracle rank, Level 2, Private. Ether storage, 1,487 points. His ether stats were uniform, around 25, while his body stats were close to 50 points except for his intelligence, which was around 4. Combined with the 25 ether intelligence points he had, his mental faculties were comparable to that of the average human on Earth, even though he still looked as stupid as ever. This could actually be explained in a very simple way. A cat's brain was not structured in the same way as a human being's. Fewer convolutions, a less developed frontal cortex, a good olfactory memory, but a poorer visual one. After magnification of these mental faculties thanks to the ether, his intelligence had definitely increased, but was definitely not comparable to that of a human. The result would probably be quite similar if a trisomic or an autistic person increased their ether stats. Their mental faculties would increase, but the behavioral disorders resulting from the genetic abnormality would still be present. They would become super trisomics, but without genetic adjustment, they could not totally correct these deficiencies unless appropriate therapy was provided. Jake had also been aware for some time of the impact of the ether of intelligence on his temperament. He had been feeling more emotional recently, as the performance of the reptilian and limbic brains had been augmented like everything else. Thankfully, he had gained in self-control, but the benefits were canceling out. Self-control depended on the prefrontal cortex, the seat of consciousness and logical reasoning. Experienced meditators increased their self-control by increasing the thickness and activity of the prefrontal cortex through training, while reducing that of the reptilian brain. The result was a successful mixture of skill and physiological adaptations that made them more able to control themselves. Other, more evolved aliens probably did not have these character issues, since their brain structure was different. Chances were that some species did not feel emotions at all, as these archaic brains had long since been abandoned in favor of other, more relevant and adapted abilities. On the other hand, if a human with a character flaw, such as an impulsive or angry side, improved their mental faculties with the ether, there was a real risk that their personality would become even more unstable. Back to his cat, Jake didn't need to think twice to understand why his cat had so much ether. Crunch just didn't know how to use it. His oracle device had simply continued to automatically absorb the ether from his prey instead, as the cat didn't care about those colored lights that couldn't be eaten. What put Jake in an even better mood was that he could take the ether from his cat without his consent. Crunch was still too stupid and naive to realize the mistake he had made in accepting this pet contract. You did well. Jake stroked his cat's head with sincere appreciation. You don't mind if I take a little bit of ether? It's been a while since you paid any rent. Jake was the only person shameless enough to ask a rent from a cat, but Crunch didn't seem to care at all, too busy purring under his master's petting. On the contrary, seeing the satisfaction of the latter, the dumb cat was extremely proud, coming to rub himself against his tattered pants in the hope of being congratulated again. Jake didn't bother about his trousers this time, too focused on transferring his cat's ether to his own bracelet. Of course, Jake wasn't a hypocrite either. He didn't want the cat to die due to lack of ether in a crucial situation. Nevertheless, what was certain right now was that Jake was by far the smartest of the two. If there was one of the two best able to invest this ether, it was definitely him. Jake left his cat about 100 points for the eventual expenses of entering and leaving cubes, then finally turned his attention to his own rewards, letting the cat get familiar with his new home. Opening his backpack, he took the 2 blue cubes out of it. The 2 cubes were about the size of a fist and emitted a faint glow. Putting his hands on them and concentrating according to Shi's instructions, information soon appeared in his mind. Kinther pure blood, quantity, 1L. Myrmidian pure blood, trace of another lineage detected, quantity, 1L. Jake was puzzled to discover that the Myrmidian blood contained another bloodline, but he remembered that Lucia was Elter on her father's side. This meant that the Oracle had actually found a way to replicate the princess' blood. At least, Jake hoped so, because otherwise, it meant that the young woman and Gerolf had been bled against their will. The Oracle system can recreate absolutely everything it has knowledge of using ether as raw material. She reassured him in a gentle voice. That's why the prices in the Oracle store are so high. Even the food from the Oracle store is made of ether. It doesn't really grow in the fields. Really? Jake frowned, not convinced. If that were true, I don't think there'd be much difference in price between a piece of food, a sword, or a gun as long as the weight is similar, right? Some materials are more complex than others to reproduce, even for the Oracle system. It's true, however, that the Oracle has the makings of a businessman. Depending on the rarity of an object in the mirror universe or the level of technology needed to make it, the price changes drastically. Only knowledge is affordable, but again it depends on what form it takes and your Oracle rank's level. So, basically the Oracle was a rip-off. But he knew that already. There were two pieces of good news, though. The first was that everything in the blue cubes was frozen in time and therefore imperishable. It worked in theory with living things as well, but each of the cubes were programmed to contain only what they were assigned to. Once empty, they were useless. It was then possible to feed them to a bracelet, which provided the precious energy and a tiny amount of the alloy needed to improve it. The high prices in the Oracle store were also partly due to their packaging, since even if you just bought a hairpin, the same blue cube would be used for delivery. The stands in the Oracle playground were an exception, since these cubes were directly connected to the main Oracle store, with food, clothing, and other items being directly removed from the blue cubes by the selling drone. This reduced costs, making prices more sensible. Well, almost. The second good news was that a liter was a lot of blood. He was used to a few drops of diluted blood, and it made a huge difference. According to She, 1/10 of that amount was enough to successfully transplant the bloodline. A good etherist could pull it off with just a sample of a few cells as long as the etheric and genetic code remained intact. Now that the problem of conservation is solved, I can focus on how to find an etherist to do the job or become one myself. Jake pondered aloud. Even if there is one on B842, you're unlikely to find it anytime soon. She ruthlessly cooled his spirits. Etherists usually have a very high Oracle rank. You won't be able to find it using the prediction function. It's okay, nothing urgent. I can start gathering information by asking Patrick or Alima. Jake made up his mind. If it doesn't work, I can always try my luck on Thelma. Of all the Oracle cities, I think this is the place where I have the best chance to find him. An individual like that must carry a reputation that follows him everywhere. There's no way anyone hasn't heard of him. It's often true, but some etherists like to keep a low profile. She warned him again. Jake grunted in response, but didn't object. If finding an etherist was too difficult, he would handle it on his own. That's what he'd always done. Let's try to stay optimistic. Jake suddenly said. I assume the 2 manuals I bought are stored in my bracelet? Not exactly. You can indeed consult the contents in the digital library of your bracelet, but you access it by connecting directly to the Oracle system database. You simply have authorization. He wasn't too happy about that. It meant that the Oracle remained the sole owner of its knowledge. If Jake really wanted to make it his own, he would have to either copy the contents or memorize it by heart. In that case, no time to waste. Jake concluded with a determined expression. Focusing mentally, the hologram of a huge book appeared in his mind. Seeing how thick the book was, he was already reluctant to open it. On the cover he could read in English, Ether Manipulation for Novice. All right. My first step in my future career as an etherist has come. The other etherists better watch out. Chapter 160 Jackpot. After taking a deep breath to give himself courage, Jake finally opened the virtual grimoire. The first reaction he had when he discovered the inside was to insult the Oracle with every curse he knew. Fuck. The cover is in English, but the inside is in the language of the mirror universe. I can't even read it. Jake raged mad at the Oracle and himself for getting ripped off so easily. I can always try to translate it as I go along, but it'll take me a while. She calmly offered in an attempt to console him. Ugh, I don't have a choice, I guess. I reckon I'm going to have to learn this language first if I want to accomplish anything in the mirror universe. It's indeed the right choice. The AI concurred. I'll have to check the prices of a dictionary in the Oracle store tomorrow, but I'm already expecting the worst. Jake sighed as he contemplated his poor 1,600 Ether PTS, 90% of which came from his cat. No need to spend. I can already copy the symbols I can translate, so you can memorize them. As for buying an English Oraclean dictionary, the best thing is to go to Thelma or the New Earth Island belonging to your government. Since they've been on B842 for so long, they must have bought one that they copied and then scanned and digitized. You should be able to get one for a few Ether points if your government aren't crooks. Maybe they're even giving it away for free to new Earthlings coming to the island. That made kind of sense. In that case, Patrick and Alima would be delighted to know that he was finally planning to visit New Earth. It was not worth recruiting, but at least they had done their job properly. After all, they were all Earth people. Even on Earth, not everyone worked for the government. Private businesses, restaurants, and so on were all independent, even if they had to pay taxes. As long as he didn't have to live there, he could still visit from time to time and enjoy it as a tourist. Jake then waited for she to finish translating the first few pages so he could start reading. This took some time, since despite the fact that she was an AI attached to his Oracle device, her abilities were limited to that of a mind trapped in a machine. She couldn't translate pages with one click or perform millions of calculations simultaneously. That kind of capability was within the scope of the programs contained in the bracelet and governed by the Oracle system. What she was doing as an Oracle AI was guiding Jake and using the functions of the bracelet wisely. Except this time the Oracle was preventing her from using those functions. So she could only use her own memories to translate at her own pace, her memory coming back to her as she discovered the symbols. Half an hour later, she had finally finished translating the first pages, and Jake could finally start reading. The introductory page gave him a definition of the ether and its nature, and that was enough to give him food for thought. The ether, or rather dream ether, is the primordial energy at the origin of the universe. No one knows where it comes from, and it is considered infinite. From ether comes energy, and from energy comes matter. The higher the density of the ether, the greater the probability that energy and matter will be generated. When the conditions are right, a Big Bang occurs, and a new universe or seed world will be born. The ether density of a universe is always increasing, along with its entropy. There are three main reasons for this. The ether of a world is constantly renewing itself, connected to its infinite source beyond time and space that no one can harness, not even the Oracle. The ether of our worlds is therefore only the crumbs of a larger source. The ether is drawn to the ether. The denser the ether is at a point, the more the ether will be drawn to that point, like matter with gravity. This means that the most powerful evolvers and players are helping to increase the density of ether in the world they live in. It's an inevitable process that nothing and no one can stop. Ether is drawn by brain activity, especially thoughts and dreams, hence the term dream ether. Some etherists have theorized that the solidified soul of living beings is actually a mini source of ether, which then allows its control. Ether is therefore attracted to life to a certain extent, and even more so to intellectually evolved life forms. A powerful spirit attracts ether just as money attracts the poor and the rich. By reading this introduction, Jake already had a better understanding of the nature of ether, but more importantly, that even without doing anything, a powerful player would continue to become stronger by attracting and tapping ether from this infinite source from which the worlds were born. This meant that the ether concentration on planet B842 would swiftly rise now that a large number of players and evolvers from different seed worlds were actively enhancing themselves. It also implied that he was close to forming his soul, since he could already control the ether inside his body. He was expecting to receive a notification from the system to congratulate him, or something like that the day he succeeded, but that didn't seem to be the case. We talk about soul when it can survive on its own after the body dies. She reminded him in a few words. But once your mind is strong enough, which is the case after you increase your intelligence, the ether begins to come to you. If your body were to die, your soul can undoubtedly be saved if we don't drag things out too much. That's what the Oracle probably does when it repatriates a player who was killed during an ordeal. He recreates a new, identical body and puts the preserved soul of the player inside. If the Oracle knows everything about us, can't he just download a copy of our consciousness into a new clone? Isn't that what he's already doing with the Oracle AIs? Jake asked with a gloomy expression. Because if he did, the clone wouldn't be aware of it. But the original is definitely dead. It's a possibility. She recognized before she fell silent again. Jake realized that he had been tactless in reminding her of her condition of duplicate consciousness, but it was too late to turn back. Instead, he decided to act as if nothing had happened by turning his attention back to the book. The next page of the manual explained the notion of etheric code. Just like the genetic code, ether's movements and patterns had concrete meaning and effects, which reinforced the theory that ether was not totally inert. There was even a major cult dedicated to Ethia in the Mirror Universe, an abstract name for the infinite source of ether at the origin of everything. Using advanced microscopy technology, the early etherists had long since observed, counted, and referenced all of these distinctly effective ether patterns, and this formed an extremely complex runic language that was named the Etherian. Anyone wishing to become an etherist or simply to better understand and control their ether had to delve into this language and become familiar with it. Even the most brainless warriors knew some Etherian runes or rune sequences for everyday life. These ether runes were too small to be consciously controlled, in the order of Planck's distance, 10 to the power of 34 m, but it was possible to reproduce them on a larger scale to achieve macroscopic effects. In order to modify the etheric code or make a transfer, however, a confirmed etherist was needed as well as several advanced technologies to observe, manipulate, and copy these infinitesimally small Etherian runes. The necessary technologies were listed, but were not developed in detail, suggesting that this was not the purpose of this novice's manual. The price of these technologies was not discussed at all, and Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety about how much ether it would cost him. When Jake finished the introduction, he moved on to the first chapter, and from the very first words he knew he had made the right choice in buying this manual. It was with unabashed excitement that he discovered the title, which single-handedly overcame all his bad moods and made him realize that he had actually hit the jackpot. Because the title of the first chapter was literally, How to Break Through Your Ether Limits. Chapter 161, How to Break Through. Breakthrough was in fact quite simple, provided you understand why such a limit existed in the first place. Every body, whether organic or inorganic, had a certain ether capacity that it could contain before reaching saturation. The body of an evolver could be compared to a bottle with the cork removed and the ether to the liquid inside. At first, the body had not yet reached its limits, so the bottle was far from full. As the ether's stats increased, the bottle filled with water until it was full to the brim, then overfilled. This was the famous ether's 100-point limit that he was now experiencing. There were only 3 ways to solve this issue. The first one, not really a solution, but an obvious one, was to increase the size of the bottle so that it could hold more water. The bigger and more massive an object or living being was, the more ether its body would contain. This was logical, and on the surface it had nothing to do with the density of ether. Whether a human was 1 meter or 100 meters tall, his ether stats would peak at 100 points, since this amount of ether was proportionally distributed throughout the body. However, the overall amount of ether that could be manipulated was undoubtedly higher. Giant etherists were the most dangerous, as were those gigantic mythical creatures with multiple ether skills from their bloodline. The second solution was to force water into the full bottle. This was the principle of using scuba tanks to hold oxygen under high pressure. By forcing more ether into the body and preventing it from coming out, there were 2 difficulties to overcome. The first problem was the resistance of the bottle, which had to be able to withstand the pressurized ether being injected into it. In other words, a strong body could hold a higher amount of ether, condensing further and further as more was added. The body stat determining the body's resistance was the constitution. The higher the constitution, the better the body's ability to withstand ether. With his 36.2 points of body constitution, Jake thought he was more than capable of breaking through that 100 points limit compared to a normal human. In fact, according to the manual, any object could withstand extremely high amounts of ether, because at a certain concentration the ether would affect the receptacle itself, causing it to adapt. In worlds where ether was abundant, the metal bathed in ether could become comparable to the mithril of fantasy tales. This meant that the quality of the vessel, or rather its body, would not be a problem for a long time. This brought him to the second element of this second solution: how to force the ether to stay in the bottle. What was certain was that the bracelet wasn't capable of doing that. The ether points he had tried to add beyond that limit had not been able to penetrate his body and had been quickly reabsorbed by his bracelet after recompression. Ether compression turned the encoded ether back into pure ether energy by sacrificing 95% of the original ether. In other words, every time he failed his breakthrough, he lost ether. Fortunately, he had quickly figured out that it was pointless to continue. The solution to this problem was very simple, but a major obstacle for many new players and evolvers. It was simply a matter of mentally controlling the ether to force it to stay in the body. In fact, he'd already done this many times before. Every time he moved the ether into a part of his body to strengthen it, the ether would actually go over the 100 points limit in that limb. If he concentrated all of his ether in his finger, he could easily exceed 1,000 points locally. Sadly, the bottle did not have a cap. How to make the ether hold inside his body. Encoding allowed the ether to be attached to our body by giving it certain functions and a specific shape that could be contained. A bit like the fact that it was complicated to fill a bottle with water vapor. By following this solution, one had to constantly control one's ether. A simple moment of inattention would disperse the accumulated ether. Jake thought he could do it with his current intelligence stats, but he couldn't be sure. All it took was a couple of minutes of dozing off, and all his efforts would be for naught. This led him to the third solution: improving the encoding. High-quality encoding could force the ether to condense so that it would take up less space. Grade 1 ether could be compared to a gas, while Grade 2 and 3 could be compared to a liquid or a solid. Each additional grade allowed the body to hold 10 times more ether without any special effort. On top of that, it was possible to include more functions in this more complex encoding, which made it possible to infuse each ether stat with passive properties comparable to an ether skill. Unfortunately, this was not free of charge. The Oracle offered the 7 Grade 1 primary encodings for free to help the new evolvers and players to survive, but everything else cost a fortune that had to be purchased from the Oracle store. Jake remembered seeing these rewards at the end of his ordeal, but he just thought they were ether skills. Grade 2 strength encoding required 1,000 credits, an amount that would have required 2 to 3 more ordeals with the same rating to be obtained. He couldn't imagine how much ether it would cost if he bought it directly from the Oracle store. Of course, there was still the possibility to consult a qualified etherist or to use Grade 2 ether crystals. In the first case, the etherist would manually modify the encoded ether that our body already contained, while making a module for the bracelet capable of performing this feat, but the cheapest way was to entrust the etherist with our ether to transform it into crystals that could be used at any time. These Grade 2 ether crystals couldn't be found in this Oracle shelter at the moment, but it was a very common currency in the older Mirror Universe planets. Since the government had been on B842 for about 20 years already, these crystals should not be that rare on Thelma or New Earth. This gave him one more reason to go there, until he learned to make these encoding on his own. By the end of the chapter, he discovered that there was a fourth solution that was not listed as such since it had nothing to do with encoding: to create an ether core. This was the whole point of Chapter 2, but it took a considerable amount of time to make it stable, and it was recommended to have at least 100 points of extrasensory perception ether in order to take this risk. Therefore, this solution was not applicable for now. Talking with She, Jake felt that the simplest solution available to him was to buy blank crystals ready to contain encoded ether. That way, he would be able to keep the ether in excess if he felt he was about to lose control of it. The good news was that he already had more than 100 of these crystals from the time he sold a gun and ammunition to Enya, the lady with the pink hair. Rummaging through his bag again to find the crystals, Jake took immediate action. Using 16 ether points to increase his intelligence by 1 point, he focused on guiding the blue ether filament produced by his bracelet. His own pupils glowed with blue and purple light, proof that he was now in control of his ether. The new ether filament was successfully guided to his brain, and Jake felt his mental clarity increase significantly. He now had 101 points of ether intelligence. But as soon as he released his control, the ether filament would passively begin to scatter as if under a gentle breeze. After that, he tried to do the reverse manipulation, guiding that blue ether filament back to one of the translucent crystals. The ether took refuge obediently inside, and the crystal turned blue like a sapphire. With its success, Jake decided to try another experiment. He controlled an equivalent portion of the ether in his brain and managed to guide it into another crystal. He now had only 99 points left and felt dumber. Feeling uncomfortable, Jake immediately reabsorbed this blue crystal to regain his 100 intelligence points. He felt better immediately after that. When you had been smart once, it was impossible to live without it. Now that he had been able to verify that this method worked, all he had to do was to decide what type of ether these crystals would contain. Because recompressing the ether via the bracelet would mean losing much of that ether, and he couldn't afford to do that. Once his plan of action was decided, Jake would get out of the shelter again to hunt digesters and max out his 7th stat. Once this goal was accomplished, it would then be time to create his ether core, which would finally solve the problem. Chapter 162. Happy? Jake wasn't the dithering type anymore. It was a defect that had been ingrained in his character in the past, but the intensive training of the last ordeal had definitely corrected this bad habit, as well as his lack of self-confidence. There was no point in thinking about what else his ether could have been used for. He had several choices, and he decided to choose power without hesitation. He only had 100 crystals and about 1,600 points of ether at his disposal. Therefore, his possibilities were limited. If he could get more crystals, he would have produced 100 red, orange, and yellow crystals, which would have given him enough to immediately double his strength, agility, and constitution in case of danger. Unfortunately, that was not possible. In the meantime, Jake made do with what he had: 30 red, orange, and yellow crystals, as well as 10 blue crystals for his intelligence. He still had the crystal that Aslael had given them upon their arrival, which he decided to keep in case of unforeseen circumstances. After preparing the crystals, he only had 1,230 points of ether left. Since this was his next objective, he then used 640 points to increase his extrasensory perception by another 10 points, raising it to 30 points. When the operation was complete, Jake had only 590 points left, but his perception of the surrounding ether was finer and the range had increased by a good meter. He could now feel and control the ether within a radius of 2 meters around him, which was enough to control the ether flow of a spear without any problem, not to mention his machete, which was much shorter. The crystals were useless if he didn't use them, and therefore he absorbed the ether they contained in his body, his ether strength, agility, and constitution reaching 130 points, while his intelligence peaked at 110 points. The improvement of his physical condition did not give him any particular sensation except for the fact that he had better control of his body and felt much lighter, as if gravity had less hold on him. In contrast, the intelligence gain was an experience that he never tired of, like healing a headache that he hadn't even been aware of in the first place. Once his first goal was accomplished, Jake didn't really want to stay locked in his booth to read a textbook about ether, whose Chapter 2 recommended at least 100 points of extrasensory perception, which he was nowhere close to having. Checking his cat's situation in the next cabin, he was able to confirm that Crunch was sleeping peacefully with all 4 paws up in the air, completely unconcerned about the world around him. Feeling a little peckish, Jake looked in his backpack for the dried digester meat he had prepared before his ordeal, as well as his gourd full of silvery blood. The smell of the meat and the sounds of Jake's chewing woke the black cat, whose snout began to wriggle as he smelled the fragrance of his upcoming meal. Seconds later, Crunch was at his feet, humming like an airplane turbine in the hope of getting some leftovers. Luckily for the cat, Jake had no shortage of food, while the digester blood had long since become ineffective. By tasting the dry, rubbery meat and sniffing the slightly nauseating smell of the partially clotted blood, he felt that he was finally not so hungry anymore. He thought he would rest for a few days, but in the end the last few months had been so hectic that those few hours of silence and peace in a monochromatic cabin paradoxically made him feel uncomfortable, to the point of feeling mildly claustrophobic. He needed action. No sooner said than done. The day was far from over. He could well make a quick outing to stretch his legs and, who knows, Maybe bring back some fresh meat for tonight. Want to come along, Crunch? Jake asked by connecting his mind to the cat's via his blue ether. It was a skill that came naturally to him after he scanned the cat with his ether earlier. When his blue ether reached the cat's brain, he was able to vaguely distinguish the animal's emotions. Naturally, he could also transmit his intentions and even images and smells if he focused. This ability did not really come from his brain, since however smart he was, he could not yet perceive the signals and the electric field of his neurons, which were about a micrometer in size. It was a capacity coming from his proto-soul that was about to stabilize. Each time he extended his consciousness to the limits of his extrasensory perception, his mind left his brain to become a mass of ether. As he captured his master's thoughts, the cat stopped eating and tapped the booth wall directly in order to get out. A vortex formed and the cat disappeared inside. Jake chuckled when he saw the cat's eagerness, and then did the same. Back in the corridor, Jake searched for the nearest orange cube, but stiffened when he came across two hatefully familiar faces. Yerode and Lamine. Or rather three. Yerode was carrying a half-naked sleeping woman on his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that they weren't planning to talk over a cup of tea. Fuck. All three players cursed at the same time when they recognized each other. What were the odds that their booths would be next to each other in a pyramid so vast that theoretically every civilian, evolver, and player in the mirror universe was entitled to their own booth? Practically zero, and yet there they were. If Jake was naive enough to think it was just a coincidence, he wouldn't be Jake anymore. He'd be a complete moron. Crunch, sensing the hostility between the three men, immediately began to growl with a muffled roar, not far from a lion's or tiger's snarl. His fighting skills were still a mystery, but his intimidation skills were up to scratch. As if an invisible gun had just gone off, the three men drew their weapons. Jake pulled out his machete and a gun, while Lamine aimed his sniper at him. Yerode also pointed a single-handed machine gun at Jake. Immediately, the trio found themselves stuck in a stalemate, a dangerous balance forming between the two sides. Crunch was the free electron of the group, ready to pounce at the slightest sign of weakness. However, he was also the most unhelpful. If he took a bullet for Jake, it would already be a victory. Still, Jake was not afraid. He was already planning to chase them when he got out of the red cube, and that idea hadn't left him. Let the woman go, or this place will be your grave. Jake delivered the order in a threatening tone. Jake had always dreamed of dropping those cheesy lines, and the situation was surprisingly appropriate. Now that his intelligence was high, these kinds of punchlines came absurdly easily to him. In response, the two mercenaries burst out laughing, pretending to wipe away some fake tears. But soon, their false laughter stopped, their faces turning into two ugly grimaces. Come and get her if you want her. Yerode sneered dismissively. Otherwise, we will fuck her good right now before you. Violence is forbidden in case you've forgotten, and I can assure you will be extremely gentle with her, haha. The two mercenaries burst out laughing again, evidently proud of their joke. If you could see your face, haha, it's gold. Yerode taunted him as he groped the breast of the young, unconscious woman with his free hand. To add insult to injury, he then grabbed the young woman's face resting on his shoulder and lifted it up just enough to place a loud kiss on her lips. If they thought that a little provocation was enough to make him lose his temper, they were wrong. He hadn't missed any of the nearby drones monitoring the corridor. Since the beginning of their altercation, more and more drones were floating towards them, and he had no doubt about what would happen if he lost his temper here. Jake walked slowly towards the two mercenaries with a defiant, smug look in his eyes, knowing full well that neither of them would dare pull the trigger. Once within 2 meters, he deployed his ether. His pupils lit up with a blue and violet glow, and he simply uttered, "Kneel." And they kneeled, horrified, seeing their leg disobeying them. The muscles of their thighs trembled to resist this contradictory nerve impulse, but after a brief resistance the duo completely lost control of their legs. A crack of kneecaps resounded, and their knees hit the metal floor. "I've come to get the girl just as you wanted." "Happy," Jake scoffed back. At that very moment, to the two mercenaries, Jake was far worse than the digesters swarming outside the shelter. He was a real demon. Chapter 163, Slave Contract. For a few more seconds, The two mercenaries continued to struggle in vain to escape Jake's control, their leg and arm muscles twitching and contracting at regular intervals. After a long effort that left them in a sweaty state, they realized the truth. They couldn't move. "What do you want from us? We haven't done anything wrong," Lamine yelled, his lower jaw trembling from fury and humiliation. He had to raise his head to talk to his tormentor, and it was extremely embarrassing. "Not done anything wrong." Jake slowly stared at the still unconscious young woman on Yerod's shoulder and then gazed again at the sniper in the eyes. "Are you fucking kidding me?" "Pooh. It's the truth. This woman belongs to us. Lamine signed a Slavic contract with her." Yerod argued by spitting a big fat slob on the floor for good measure. "A slave contract?" Jake repeated in an icy tone, increasing his mental pressure until he forced them to put their foreheads against the ground. He knew about the pet contract, since Crunch had agreed to one with him. He also knew that each creature had a value estimated by the Oracle system in the mirror universe, and that anyone could be bought once the period of diplomatic immunity would be over. Of course, active players and evolvers with at least a rank 6 were the exception. However, this was the first time he had heard of this contract, and he had no idea under what circumstances it was signed. If it was the same principle as the pet contract, it only required the consent of the future slave, which was hard to imagine. If it was as simple as that to be enslaved, he would have to be particularly careful in the future. "It wasn't us who forced her to sign." Yerod growled in frustration as he gritted his teeth. He, who hadn't yet awakened his 7th stat, could feel an alien presence lurking around his mind, as if his thoughts were being exposed. Which was indeed the case. Even if a person had a strong mind, without perceiving the ether it was impossible to feel the connection of Jake's mind to theirs. Unlike Crunch, their thoughts were more complex but also human, which made them easier to interpret actually. He still couldn't translate thoughts into words, but he could feel whether they were telling him the truth or not. Apparently, Yerod hadn't lied. They hadn't actually forced her to sign that contract. "Then who did?" Jake asked. "Her husband," Lamine said in a visibly uncertain tone. Jake inspected the young woman in more detail and found her appearance familiar. Vase-colored skin, though pretty, primitive fur as a tunic and fluorescent hair. Her ears were also slightly pointed. Looking back quickly at his memories of before the ordeal, he remembered the 2.5-meter giant who had challenged him to a duel to claim the girls in his group. Jake had stuck a bullet in his skull without qualms, which had ended the fight before it even started. The women were indeed more petite and slender in this species, and he remembered that a sort of orgy had taken place in their makeshift camp when they arrived at the Red Cube. These women did indeed appear to be slaves, although he blamed their behavior on cultural differences and their primitiveness at the time. "And where is this husband?" Jake asked again, loosening the control over their upper bodies so they could straighten up and answer. The two mercenaries exchanged an embarrassed look. "So, we shot him a few minutes before entering the Black Cube." Lamine confessed with an expression showing no remorse. "A good bullet between the eyes. There was another girl we played with before. Unfortunately, she was a little young. She didn't make it." Jake squinted and stared at them in turn, a heavy atmosphere quickly settling in between the two parties. Finally uncomfortable with this prolonged eye contact, Jake simply controlled their upper body to kiss the ground again with a resounding smack. Because the two mercenaries were in perfect sync, it felt like they were praying to their new god, which added considerably to their frustration. At that very moment, their hatred for Jake was at its peak. A little more, and they weren't sure they would be able to restrain themselves. "That still doesn't explain to me why she signed a slave contract with you," Jake said, changing the subject. This time he didn't let them get up. When that fluorescent orc thing died, Lamine immediately got a notification from the Oracle system asking if he was willing to sign the slave contract. Of course, he agreed. You don't turn down a good deal like that. Jake thought that once the slaver was dead, that all the slaves under his authority would be set free again. That didn't seem to be the case. A slave was doomed to remain a slave in the mirror universe if he couldn't redeem his freedom. "What can you do with this contract?" Jake questioned them one last time, especially worried about the answer. "Everything. Absolutely everything." Lamine broke out with a gravelly laugh. "The slave may not disobey any order except one that would result in her immediate death, such as ceasing to breathe or jumping from a ravine. She's our plaything right now, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was all well and good. But how did the Oracle enforce these contracts? Unless it was. Jake took a look at his own bracelet and got the confirmation he was looking for when he heard she's guilty answer. I don't have control over those contracts. She apologized with a melancholy voice. It is indeed the bracelet that enforces the contract. How? Jake didn't want to hear the answer. Taking control of your brain. Some of the liquid alloy in the bracelet is circulating in your body. If the Oracle wishes, he can take control at any time. Yerode and Lamine could not see Jake's horrified expression, since they still had their foreheads glued to the ground, but his silence was worse for them than when he was posing questions. At least they felt they could negotiate. What if he just left and let them like this? Right now, Jake was seriously considering the idea of cutting off his forearm where the bracelet was as if it were an intolerable itch, but he immediately changed his mind. The metal was circulating in his bloodstream. No matter what he did, he had no way of fighting the Oracle's technology. Don't worry about that. She gently reassured him. If you play by the rules, the Oracle system is the most impartial being ever. After all, it is a program. It has to play by its own rules. It's what you think or think you know. Jake replied curtly. Who's to say your memories haven't been tampered with again? But I do know one thing. The Oracle is powerful enough to control everyone on B842, but it doesn't. Free will is important to it, but it has value, like everything else. As long as you have what it takes to protect your freedom, no one can take it away from you. This woman is a slave because she agreed to sign this slave contract. It doesn't matter if she was threatened or she did it of her own free will. The facts are there. She gave up her freedom of her own free will. It was a valid argument. Certainly, Jake could become a slave without a will by the mere fact that he carried an Oracle device inside him, but it also meant that anyone signing a contract with him through the Oracle system was absolutely trustworthy. It certainly worked for business transactions or promises of any kind. Suddenly exhausted, Jake took one last look at the unconscious young woman, and then with a deep sigh resumed his walk to the nearest orange cube. After Jake passed by, Crunch discreetly pissed on the two mercenaries with the precision of an automatic sprinkler. Once Jake was far enough, Yerode and Lamine felt the control of their bodies come back to them, and then abruptly stood up flushed with anger and a visceral desire to eviscerate the cat. Bad luck for them. That was what the cat was waiting for. With a spark of mischief in his eyes, the cat sent two last shots of hot piss into the wide, open mouths of the two mercenaries before running away behind his master. Coughing and holding back with great pain from vomiting, they could only watch with hatred as the pair of wicked fiends disappeared with great disregard into the orange cube. It was a total humiliation. Chapter 164 Weird Feeling. Reappearing to another orange cube in an empty corridor, Jake stood still for a moment, his arms trembling. Fuck! Jake yelled as he punched the wall to his right. He was mad as hell. 1. He had failed to save the young woman. And 2. He had gotten carried away with no direct benefit except a few pieces of information that he could surely have obtained on his own. Jake was neither an angel nor a saint, but to see two criminals take a young woman away to her, without being able to do anything when he had the strength to prevent it was a horrible feeling combining anger at oneself, guilt, and feelings of powerlessness. He was not deluded, he could feel it. If he had tried to control the bodies of Yerode and Lamine with the intention of executing them outside, the drones would have moved in before he could take action, like in a bad remake of Minority Report. The Oracle drones didn't need to wait for a crime to occur before making their move. Because of the Oracle's prediction system, they knew from the start when a violent altercation would occur. No matter how hard you thought about hurting or killing someone, as long as the drones let it happen, it meant that you didn't really have the courage or foolishness needed to take action. What the Oracle system considered to be violence wasn't clear to him yet, but what was certain was that verbal or psychological violence was not part of it. The only thing that mattered was the notion of physical harm. Using the mindfulness technique he had become accustomed to during the ordeal, Jake took a deep breath and calmed down. Now that Yerode and Lamine knew what he was capable of, he could no longer afford to hang around. As long as his mental faculties remained considerably superior to theirs, Jake was confident that he could control them as he had just done earlier. The important thing was that what he had just done to them, other more advanced evolvers or players could do to him in return. The two mercenaries had clearly not awakened their seventh stat, or they could at least have resisted by controlling their ether flow. Jake sincerely wondered what their ordeal rewards had been used for when their mental stats were so low. And yet, when he really thought about it, it wasn't really a surprise. The two mercenaries had mediocre intelligence to begin with, and the intelligence malice associated with Thrasgenian physique had made them moderately stupid during this ordeal. They probably only thought about increasing their physical abilities. Only out of the red cube could they have realized what mistakes they had made, whether it was out of stupidity or impulsiveness. On the other hand, they had brilliantly accomplished what the Oracle expected of them by poisoning the gladiators of the Ludus and stealing the Myrmidian blood supply. He didn't know what rewards the two fellows had chosen, but it could only be something good. Yerode and Lamine simply couldn't use it easily in the Ludus unless they had chosen to obtain the Myrmidian bloodline, in which case the effects wouldn't show up right away, but their progress would be greatly accelerated. Once again, Jake calmly retraced his steps back, taking a multitude of orange cubes to finally reach the outside of the pyramid. He had hesitated to notify the rest of his group, but everyone was in different booths. It would have taken him forever. The sky above the black cube was still full of dark clouds with red lightning, but a rain shower had begun to drum against the translucent walls protecting the Oracle shelter. It reminded him of the feeling he had at home when he looked out his window at a storm, and for some inexplicable reason it gave him a sense of relief. There were many things Jake wanted to do right now, but in the end he decided to visit the mission halls first. He intended to go out of the shelter to collect ether, so if he could get paid at the same time, he wouldn't miss the chance. There weren't many real buildings in the Oracle shelter. The two missions halls were easily recognizable because they formed a sort of pentagon empty in the middle, in the center of which stood a huge red cube comparable to the one in which he had completed his first ordeal. Each side of the pentagon had different symbols on its facade, and these corresponded to the two mission halls and the three halls for civilian, evolvers, and players respectively. These halls were connected to each other to facilitate communication between different types of missions and individuals. An Oracle mission usually required powerful evolvers or players, but occasionally a civilian with a particular area of expertise might be needed. In this case, being able to get the information to the relevant halls as quickly as possible was crucial. The central area of the shelter where the buildings with the different geometrical shapes were located was relatively small. It only took a few minutes to walk around it. It was the space within these buildings that was gigantic. A moment later, Jake was in front of the pentagonal building and ran directly into the vortex in front of him without checking if it was the right hall. It didn't matter since all the buildings seemed to be connected inside the Oracle buildings by different transporters. Once inside, a warm hall greeted him. Varnished wooden floors, burgundy red wallpaper, chandeliers on the ceiling providing subdued light, round tables, and an American bar with a multitude of bottles and barrels stored behind reminiscent of a tavern. The only difference was that this tavern was thrice the size of a football stadium, while the ceiling was high enough to accommodate even the most imposing creatures. Jake looked around the lobby with curiosity, then decided to go straight to the bar to ask for information. After all, the few people and aliens present didn't seem to want to be disturbed. The American bar, just like the tables and chairs, had different heights to accommodate all kinds of customers. Unlike the drones he was used to, a real person was standing on the other side of the bar ready to serve. It was an elderly man with long salt and pepper hair wearing an old, shabby leather armor, completely worn down at the sleeves. A long broken horn in the middle grew from the right side of his skull, curved just enough to give him the charisma of a coat rack. The base of his nails, or rather his yellowish claws, were blackened by dust, but paradoxically the bar was sparkling clean. The barman was actively rubbing the surface with a brand new cloth in a monotonous gesture, spitting on it from time to time before starting to rub again. "Hello, sir. Could you please tell me which hall I'm in?" Jake asked tentatively. The old man stared at him for a long time without saying anything, then pointed a long hooked finger in another direction. Jake gazed in the indicated direction and came upon a group of humans coming out of a dark corridor. Jake squinted and recognized the two soldiers he had met a few hours earlier, but there were three other people with them. He recognized the first one. It was Will. It seemed that the former businessman couldn't rest either. Or maybe it was in his nature to look for opportunities by building new relationships in places like this. The two individuals bringing up the rear, Jake had never seen them before. At first glance, they were a woman and a man, both wearing New Earth Government Special Forces uniforms. Their aura, however, was different from that of Alima and Patrick walking in front. Over their armor they wore long hooded coats and a sort of mask with an opaque visor that made it impossible to see their faces hidden behind. And yet, Jake had a strange feeling when he saw them. As they got closer, this feeling became stronger and stronger, and when the group got in front of him, it became unstoppable. Ignoring the cheerful greetings of Alima and Patrick, he stared at the woman in the mask for a long time, frowning, uncertain as to what he felt. "It's good to see you alive, Jake. Aren't you even going to hug your cousin?" The woman suddenly said as she removed her mask. Jake's eyes suddenly widened as he heard this voice he thought he'd never hear again. Anya. Chapter 165. Jake's cousins. How? It was the first word that came into his mouth after reuniting with his cousin. Of course, finding his uncle and his cousin had always been a top priority for him. When he had a few seconds to spare, he would wish to find them as soon as possible via the prediction function, and a path would thus be generated. Whenever he felt like it, a path could show him how to find his uncle as quickly as possible. But when it came to finding his cousin, the Oracle device was always silent. When he arrived in the mirror universe, a path still existed, but when he tried again a few hours later, he received only silence in response. He had not panicked, because he himself was unreachable during his ordeal, unless the person wishing to find him was in the same ordeal as him. There was also the possibility that she was in an area under the control of the digesters where the Oracle was probably blind, or that her Oracle rank was higher than his, or that she had a cloaking device or skill that could conceal her existence from the other bracelets. He had seen several of these awards in the Oracle store. In response, Anya hugged him, almost cracking his bones despite his new physical stats. After lifting him off the ground briefly, Jake returned her hug by gently patting her back to signal her that he needed to breathe. Realizing that she was crushing his ribs, she loosened her embrace slightly, and he was finally able to breathe again. "Sorry, Jake. You have no idea how good it makes me feel to see you alive." Anya apologized with slightly watery eyes, although she kept smiling. "I couldn't find you with the Oracle since yesterday, but when you magically reappeared this morning, I rushed over as soon as I could." Jake's face relaxed visibly as he discovered his cousin's emotional reaction. It was rare to see such an expressive response from her. Usually, she was protective of him, but she was cordial enough not to appear cold. Anya was the perfect example of a good Wilderth. Pretty, medium-length chestnut hair, green eyes, athletic, with an exemplary academic background that allowed her to directly obtain a key position in the government with her Uncle Kalen's string pulling. Jake didn't know what her job consisted of, but he was probably the only Wilderth who had settled for a mundane job before acquiring his bracelet. Unlike him, who couldn't handle the family pressures and competition, Anya had embraced them, feeding off them to move forward. A good part of the reason why the rest of his family didn't bother him was, of course, because he had lost his parents young, but the other reason was Anya's achievements. Because he had been a positive influence on her, driving her to excel, he hadn't been pushed hard. The contempt and taunting of her other cousins had nevertheless been enough to make him feel that he didn't belong there anymore. "I really thought you were dead for a while, but look at you. If I wasn't guided by an Oracle path, I probably wouldn't have recognized you," Anya exclaimed, pinching his toned biceps in amazement. "I guess your first ordeal went well." Well, she was not wrong. The last time Anya saw him, Jake was a few centimeters shorter and was somewhat out of shape with a total lack of physical fitness. His hair hadn't seen the shadow of a barber for over 6 months, and his skin was suffering from mild acne due to his junk food excesses. The Jake in front of her was a tall man, about 1.88 m tall, 7 centimeters taller, and significantly heavier than before. The only difference was that his extra pounds were pure muscle. In addition to the muscle gain from training during the ordeal, he owed his gain in height and weight to the elevation of his ether constitution. Beyond a certain point, the ethers started to affect his body to a certain extent. The effects were negligible in the short term, but every day that passed his body was transformed to adapt to the ever-increasing load of ether in his body. Cough, cough. An intentional cough echoed beside the siblings, bursting the bubble of joy marking their reunion. Even though it was only a cough, Jake felt irritated without knowing why. Frowning, he carefully inspected the other soldier wearing a mask, but there was no sign that he knew him. This was not impossible, however, since he was accompanying She. Do I know this guy too? He thought mentally with a slight doubt. Long time no see, Jake. It's hard to recognize the Wilderth's loser when I see you today. The guy said in a tone of mockery that was hard to distinguish, but it was there. The vein in Jake's temple swelled violently when he recognized the intonation. Damn, he hated this guy. Long time no see, Charles. Assholes like you, on the other hand. I recognize them easily even when they hide their faces under a mask. Jake insulted him ruthlessly, immediately returning the favor. Maybe a few months earlier he would have tolerated his cousin's jeers or mocking insinuations, but it was different now. Even if this guy turned out to be an overpowered evolver in the end, he didn't care as long as he was in an Oracle City. With Anya around, he had nothing to worry about, especially since he knew Charles's character well. He was the family scientist, working in aerospace at a very prestigious position. His intelligence and ingenuity was undeniable, but when it came to combat, he was probably as ignorant as Jake was before his ordeal. However, he was no slacker. Whereas Jake was a notorious procrastinator before he got his bracelet, Charles had always taken care of his body, training regularly and following an impeccable diet. He was a maniacal person, obsessed with his appearance, his health, and whose happiness depended on the admiration others had for him. Basically, a superficial person, but who had gotten this far precisely because of this. After the insult Jake had just hurled at him, he could easily imagine his cousin's angry, congested face under his mask. Yet, contrary to the verbal exchange he had expected, in which he intended to test his over 1,000 IQ to deliver the most creative insults of his life, Charles remained calm. Just like Anya a few seconds earlier, he lowered his hood and took off his mask before smiling wryly. A large scar ran across his face from his upper right forehead to the bottom of his right cheek. Seeing the healed wound on his cousin's face, Jake was stunned on the spot for a short while, but he quickly came to his senses. With all the digesters he had faced since his arrival in the mirror universe, it was impossible for all his cousins to escape unharmed. His survival also had a lot to do with luck. It seems your balls are a lot heavier than they used to be, cousin, but I like it, Charles said before giving him a manly hug too. Jake didn't know how to react, but he decided to bury the hatchet for now. He wasn't in the mood for revenge anymore. Taking advantage of the reunion, he asked Anya the question that really mattered to him. How is Uncle Kalen? Jake asked with a serious expression. His cousin stopped inspecting his new physique with curiosity and answered in a soothing voice that was meant to reassure him. He's doing well. You know him. He was in the army before. Using his connections, he made it to New Earth easily before the Earth was fully teleported. Jake didn't like that answer, and Anya could read the growing resentment on his face. Uncle Kalen and I didn't abandon you, Jake. We just couldn't join you. Anya explained, trying to justify their behavior. I just joined the government, and Uncle Kalen was retired. By the time we learned the truth, it was too late. We couldn't contact you. I don't understand. It was the truth. Jake didn't get what stopped them from telling him everything, just as the government could have saved many lives by informing them in advance. Anya sighed long and hard in response. Let's sit down at a table first, and I'll explain everything. It's more complicated than you think. Chapter 166, The Truth, Part 1. The hall with the saloon atmosphere they were in was the player hall. The reason there was a bar, dining tables, or doors leading to private lounges was simply because it was a good way for players entering or exiting an ordeal to wait or take the pressure off, but also to recruit teammates. From the fifth ordeal onwards, the Red Cube sometimes recommended forming a team. Even more rarely, in the more advanced ordeals, having a faction was required. Being a solo player was of course possible, and in the case of these ordeals, these solo players would come together to form a new team. The reason why the Red Cube left such information and the possibility for players to organize themselves in the more advanced ordeals was sadly obvious. The higher the ordeal number, the fewer potential participants there were in the running. The stakes being very high, even for the Oracle itself, it was essential to ensure that there were enough players, since the enemy was usually players from another mirror universe and under the supervision of another Oracle. Beyond that, Jake didn't know the other details, since that was all she was able to reveal with his current rank 5 of sergeant. He would only be able to get more information on the subject after surviving his 5th ordeal, which many considered the first true ordeal because dying became possible with real goals and stakes attached. Accepting Anya's proposal, Jake and the rest of the group sat down at one of the tables, with a drone flying quickly to their side to suggest a drink after transferring the list of available drinks in the language of the mirror universe to their wristband. Ugh, more weird symbols. Jake and Will grumbled at the same time. Seeing their reaction, Anya and Charles were shaken by a slight laugh. I almost forgot you just arrived in the mirror universe, her cousin said in an amused tone. You don't speak Oraclean yet, but neither do we. Order anything, and the drone will bring it to you. The bartender is just for special orders. It's not the ordering that worries me, it's the price. We've seen what it looks like in the Oracle playground. Will replied with a face tortured between his desire for a drink and that of being satisfied with the water from his canteen. No worries. Today's on me. Anya offered with a smile that was meant to be encouraging. I can at least do that for our reunion. Jake remained silent, feeling slightly awkward. He wasn't used to his cousin being so generous. Thinking about what she had just said, he took the opportunity to change the subject. The Oraclean? I thought you'd have started to learn by now if you'd gotten to be 842 so long before I did. Jake commented, falsely surprised. I know a few words and symbols, but that's not my thing. Anya confessed without shame. In New Earth, there's only Earthlings, so all the buildings and cubes, even the Oracle store, is in English there. You can also choose other languages of Earth origin as translation options, so learning the Oraclean wouldn't have been of much use. But some specialists speak it fluently, as do most evolvers and players at the top. Charles speaks it a little bit, too. Charles, who was already sipping his coffee delivered by the drone, proudly straightened up, hearing Anya's compliment. Some habits had a hard time, although the new scar across his face had greatly reduced his arrogance. Having no idea of how much ether a coffee costs nor of Anya's savings, Jake and Will opted for a coffee as well. So did Alima and Patrick. The reasoning was that if Charles allowed himself to take such a hot drink without hesitation, it must not have been that expensive. Only Anya took a juice. I was planning to go to New Earth one day to see if I could find a cheap Oraclean dictionary there. Please tell me that even exists. Jake probed with another question. Of course it exists. Anya nodded. I even have one on me if you're interested. I don't use it much, and it's free for government personnel. Putting her backpack on the table, her cousin rummaged around inside looking for the so-called dictionary. Jake was surprised that Anya could carry such an item, because the dictionary was supposed to be an absolutely huge book, even with a tiny font. In the end, the young woman found what she was looking for and took a USB flash drive out of her bag in a victorious manner. "Tada, it's all in there," Anya said as she handed him the flash drive. Jake looked confusedly at the thumb drive in his palm. Then he remembered that he had been able to merge his smartphone with his Oracle device, and therefore, it must have been possible to transfer the contents of a flash drive. Just put the flash drive connector against your wristband. The contents should be transferred instantly. You can also directly let the wristband swallow the flash drive, but I think your cousin would like it back, so we'll skip it. Following her exact instructions, Jake snapped his flash drive into his wristband, whose molten alloy shifted to form the proper opposing plug. A second later, the download complete notification rang out. He was then able to unplug the key and return it to his cousin. Jake made 2 or 3 mental attempts to check if the contents were accessible, and at one thought, an English/Oraclean dictionary appeared before his eyes. This was good news for she as well, since her memories of the language were no longer limited to immediate comprehension and translation. She could once again understand and speak the language fully. Meanwhile, the rest of the coffees and juice were also served and the drone left, sailing to another customer. As the silence settled again, Jake grew serious and returned to the main topic, namely, why she and her uncle hadn't given him any news and hadn't tried to warn him. So, Anya sighed again when she saw her brother's expression, but this time Charles patted her shoulders to signal that he could handle it. It's very simple. Did you try talking to some local natives about the mirror universe during your ordeal? Charles asked all of a sudden. Jake opened his mouth wanting to say something, then closed it again. Will, beside him, closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them again in vain. So, unfortunately, you do not know. Charles concluded coolly. I give you the answer loud and clear. You can't. What do you mean? You mean the Oracle forbids it? Jake assumed with puzzlement. No, the Oracle is stopping you. Literally. Jake thought back to what he had just learned about the slave contract, and his face became gloomy. Seeing his cousin's expression, Jake confirmed his hunch with a nod. Will, for his part, was still confused, but on seeing their expressions he suspected that the explanation would not please him. That's right. If you try to reveal anything in any way, the bracelet will stop you by taking control of your will. What do you mean? Will inquired more and more confused. Jake took the opportunity to recount his recent experience and what he'd learned about the slave contract. Anya, Charles, and the other two soldiers listened silently with a jaded look that showed they were used to this kind of thing. Will, like Jake earlier, was horrified, but his businessman's mind focused instead on the positive aspects of this. It made it possible to have reliable employees, partners, and customers, especially in the Oracle cities. The bracelet does it differently in this case, since we are not slaves. Charles nuanced what Jake said. It's, quite frankly, much more vicious. At first, the bracelet will simply block the vocal cords or scramble sounds by forcing unintelligible speech. If the individual persists, for example by attempting sign language, the bracelet will crack down. By manipulating neurotransmitters in the brain, the liquid metal in the bracelet will then directly attack motivation by modulating dopamine and serotonin levels. If that's not enough to discourage the person, it prevents him or her from doing so by making him or her forget the idea. When the urge to reveal anything comes back, it starts all over again. For those who really insist and cling to the idea of revealing everything by writing down what they need to do or recording everything on a computer or paper, the same principle applies. The Oracle prevents them from doing so, and they come to their senses a little later wondering what they were doing. Those who really insist have huge black holes in their memory after trying a few dozen times, because the bolder the trick to reveal information, the more memories are lost. The Oracle doesn't go into detail. If an engineer tries to build a machine to reveal the truth, he simply won't know how to build it before he even starts. These forgetfulnesses are irreversible. Jake and Will were chilled when they heard those last words. Chapter 167, The Truth Part 2. After a few unsuccessful attempts, Charles continued. The government yielded and chose to keep the secret. The only way that has ever worked to reveal the existence of the mirror universe is simply to take someone there. But once they go in, they too are subject to secrecy, as they immediately receive a bracelet. The explanation was even more creepy and sordid than they imagined. Jake still preferred his view that all politicians were bastards. At least he could blame someone. Well, what? Did you really think everyone in government was a self-centered asshole who only served his own interests? Anya scoffed at him sweetly. Even if that was true for 99% of them, there'd always be one to try and tell the world everything. Especially since New Earth's most powerful evolvers and players were originally simple soldiers. They have no political interests and no one to blackmail them or force them to keep quiet. On second thought, it kind of made sense. Without the concept of evolver or player, Jake thought it was plausible for the government to hide the truth by controlling information. It was unlikely, though, but definitely not impossible. In fact, that's what he'd always thought until now. However, with the evolvers and advanced players, that justification no longer held. The Earth government had no way to track down each and every one of these elite soldiers unless all of these evolvers and players were all, without exception, extremely loyal, which Patrick and Alima said was not the case at all. So he had to face the facts. The government was incapable of fully revealing the truth unless it brought each person one by one on B842. Stopping on this line of thought, Jake faced a problem. Why not just take the whole of humanity to B842? He asked. I imagine you came straight to New Earth, or at least a government-controlled base, right? Alima answered this time. 2 reasons. It's expensive, and New Earth doesn't have enough space. You have to remember that even today New Earth is only the size of a small country. By the way, how did you get to B842 before we were all transported here? Will asked with genuine curiosity. A cube. Yes, a yellow cube. Anya confirmed between 2 sips of juice. The cities supposedly destroyed in the false World War weren't all blown up, and not many nuclear missiles were actually fired. The digesters simply barged in from a spatial rift, and we defended ourselves. The Oracle Guardians then intervened, leaving a cube behind after eliminating the digesters and cleansing those areas of radiation. Whether it was Paris, London, Tokyo, New York, or Beijing, there were large yellow cubes there that the government could use as they wished. The Oracle Guardians donated a few bracelets as well as a large quantity of ether corresponding to the digesters that our armies and missiles had eliminated, which made it possible to finance the first uses of the yellow cube which, like here, are fixed at 50 points of ether per person. Jake's neurons were in turmoil. There was a hint in his cousin's words that was deeply distressing to him. If very few cities have been completely destroyed, was Paris one of them? Jake asked coldly, as if allowing himself to hope might extinguish that hope again. Anya replied with a sorry expression. When I learned the truth, that was the first thing I checked. Paris was practically destroyed by the digesters before the Oracle Guardians arrived, but there were many survivors. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get any news about your parents. It's not impossible that they survived and then were taken away by an Oracle Guardian. They did indeed bring some survivors with them, but the probability is too low. Anya didn't dare to tell him clearly that his parents were dead for good, but he got the message. They were neither military nor specially trained in combat. There was no reason for an Oracle Guardian to take enough interest in them to take them with him. Seeing Jake's face fall back into despair and then turn deadpan, Anya freaked out. Remembering why she had come in the first place, she immediately mentioned something else. You were talking about going to New Earth? Why don't we go there now? Uncle Kalen will be glad to see you again, and Grandfather will also be relieved to know one more Wilderth survived. Did any of them die? Jake caught the subtlety in what his cousin was saying. Some of them, yes. Charles growled. My brother and my mother, for starters, but most of them are just missing. We'll have to wait a few days to be sure. On hearing this information, a deadly silence fell over the group. Jake wasn't particularly close to Charles and his family originally, so he didn't feel particularly sad, but it was still a depressing moment. He was probably not the only Wilderth orphan anymore. To New Earth, I'll go, but not right away. Now that I have a dictionary, there's no hurry. Jake said, as if nothing had happened after a while. Why? Anya complained in a disappointed tone. You'd be safe there, and the government wants to record the new player's second ordeal scores. If you get a good result, it'll be a credit to the family, especially Grandpa. How the government treats the new players depends a lot on that result. Jake and Will frowned in response. The results of ordeal are given only to the player himself. How could the government record anything? Will asked aloud the question that Jake had been wondering about. Come with me, and you'll find out. His cousin answered with a false air of mystery. It'll be a chance to see if you're a loser or not for real. Charles added jokingly. Vincent holds the family record for the moment, holding 48 minutes and 16 seconds inside. If you do better, it'll sure make you look good in the eyes of the family. Ugh, I lasted 5 minutes and 8 seconds, I think. Patrick lamented, scratching his head in embarrassment. And I 21 minutes. Alima bragged to the side. But it's the worst memory of my life. Jake and Will were getting more and more confused. Their talk didn't sound at all like the kind of ordeal they'd just finished. I don't understand a word you're saying, Jake and Will said after they exchanged looks. Every ordeal has a training theme that comes back in different forms each time. Patrick explained patiently. The first one has a fitness and combat theme. Depending on the world you're sent into, it can include the use of firearms or explosives, but hand-to-hand combat remains at the heart of the learning process. We're talking about the second ordeal, the simplest and the most difficult of all. No one can fail this ordeal. Charles completed without joking this time. I mean, failing the main objective. It's also the shortest ordeal we know of. And yet, it is undoubtedly the hardest. Chapter 168, she conned herself. That's all well and good, but all the more reason not to do it right away. Jake flatly refused his cousin's proposal. Many may just want to get through the first ordeals as quickly as possible, but I intend to do them with flying colors. Ditto, Will added resolutely. These ordeals are nothing urgent at the moment, and what I need most right now is ether to pump up my stats and start my business. Anya still tried for a few minutes after that to convince him. repeating several times that neither the power nor the stats of the player were important for this ordeal. Obviously, she could not describe the ordeal in detail. The Oracle forbade it. She couldn't even tell whether it was a survival test requiring fighting or a battle of wits focusing on brainpower. In the end, apart from the fact that the ordeal was short, he didn't get any concrete information. Besides, Anya, stop. Jake cut short her attempts to convince him. Even if I was 10 times stronger than I am today, there's no way I'd do this ordeal under the watchful eye of the government. What's in it for me besides tattooing a target on my back? Family honor. I don't give a damn about it. Ugh. Anya grew pale when she heard his answer, even though she expected it. There are advantages if you perform well, and the government will notice you. Like what? Jake retorted sarcastically. Getting hired as a recruit without an interview? Or having my actions monitored? Or that everyone who has access to my information knows exactly if I'm stronger or weaker than they are so they can conspire behind my back? No need to even think about it. My answer is no. And where will you take your ordeal in this case? We can do this in family, if it's the government that's bothering you. Anya tried one last time. Even less. Apart from you and Uncle Kalen, I don't care about anyone else. No offense, Charles, but it's the truth. None taken. Charles replied with a guilty smirk. If he were in Jake's shoes, he probably would have reacted the same way. What if I give you a proper reward to motivate you? His cousin regained her energy as she tried a new idea. Below 10,000 ether points. It's not even worth mentioning. Jake said with a shark-like expression, saying he wouldn't go any lower. Anya, who thought she'd found enough of a carrot to soften him up, slumped down on the table, taking her head in her hands as she received his answer. She was totally discouraged now. Although the government was giving them enough ether to pay for a few coffees, most of her savings came from the ordeals and a few missions on B842. After maxing out her stats and buying a few ether skills, she didn't have that much ether. Stubborn, you'll see. Don't forget what you just said. Anya muttered, waving at Charles to get up. Jake raised a baffled eyebrow as he pondered her last statement, but he quickly put it aside in a corner of his head. If his cousin was stupid enough to give him 10,000 ether points, who was he to refuse? By the way, he had only talked about a minimum. 10,000 points was for the right to negotiate with him. Will gave Jake a thumbs up, hailing his masterstroke. Until now, he had viewed Jake as a smart, ruthless person, but not so ruthless that he would swindle his own cousin. If Jake could read his mind, he would have said she had conned herself. He hadn't done anything. You're leaving already? Jake exclaimed with a slight surprise. Well, sadly, yes, my dear cousin. We're still on duty. Charles explained in an apologetic tone. Anya simply insisted on coming for you as soon as she was able to detect you again. Otherwise, I'd still be in my lab dissecting a digester corpse. I'm wearing soldier's armor, but since I joined New Earth, I haven't set foot outside a shelter even once. This was more in keeping with the character Jake remembered. His job, on the other hand, seemed to have changed quite a bit. Didn't you used to work in aerospace? He asked curiously. Charles's face lit up when he heard the word aerospace. Times are changing. I've had to retrain. But my work hasn't changed much, except that I've had to take up biology a bit. These digesters are fascinating creatures. Did you know, for example, that the eyeball of a digester above rank 4 can replace rubies as a solid-state amplifying medium in military lasers? No, and I don't care. Jake answered curtly. If he didn't stand firm, he risked being drawn into a never-ending argument. Feeling the risk, Anya grabbed the mad scientist cousin by the arm, forcing him to follow her. Once she was sure that Charles would not engage in a long and passionate speech, she gave Jake one last hug before bidding him farewell. Don't take unnecessary risks, Jake. Wait till I get back. It should only take a few days. Her cousin reminded him in a warning tone. Don't worry. I'm the cautious type, you know me. Jake responded with a flawless poker face. If she knew he was there looking for a mission and intended to get out of the shelter right after, she probably would have knocked him out and forcibly brought him back with her. Knowing her, it was better to drop a little lie. Alima and Patrick stayed with Jake and Will, since they were presently off duty until the next day. They had already reported the arrival of Earth survivors in this Oracle shelter to their superior, and Anya was going back to Thelma to make her own report. Their mission was thus already over, since Cho Min-ho had agreed to collaborate with New Earth. Each new Earthling arriving in this shelter would first go through the Korean faction. No one was fooled. Both soldiers knew that Cho Min-ho would use this opportunity to recruit as many survivors as possible, but the government didn't care as long as he obeyed orders and collaborated when asked. The Earth government had a lot of cohesiveness concerns and strong internal tensions, but it still had nothing to fear from new emerging factions like these. No matter how talented a player was, the government elites had had 20 years to prepare themselves. This was also one of the reasons why they had been so willing to keep it a secret, to ensure that their new government would always be strong enough to command respect. Naturally, it hadn't worked out exactly as they wanted it to, as multiple veteran players and evolvers were breaking with New Earth more and more. With the help of the two soldiers, Jake and Will made their way to the Oracle Mission Hall. The atmosphere was much more metallic and uncluttered in this section, as one would expect from the architectural and decorative sense of the Oracle. Everything was cold and functional, with information terminals and drones everywhere, as always. The hall was not empty, though. Some of the terminals and drones were occupied by various aliens of all kinds. A disgusting human-sized batracian was trying to catch one of the drones with its tongue like a toad swallows bugs, but the drone just dodged lazily as it continued to give out incomprehensible croaks. Jake didn't know if the alien could understand anything, but it seemed to work, as a few minutes later the batrachian went off on all 6 legs with a satisfied look on its face, not to mention drooling on the sparkling tile floor. While inspecting the area, Jake recognized a few people, including one of Cho Min-ho's bodyguards, whom he decided to ignore completely. He also recognized, since fate seemed to want their paths to cross, Inya, accompanied by the other woman with pink hair resembling her. For once, she had no guards with her and was absorbed by the terminal in front of her. The two noble women looked pretty stressed out. At last Jake and Will found Sarah a little further away, communicating orally with one of the Oracle drones in search of a mission within her reach. Apparently, Jake and Will weren't the only ones unable to stay put. Chapter 169 Mission Halls. Where's Crunch? Jake said suddenly, realizing his cat wasn't following them anymore. To tell the truth, he didn't even remember having seen the cat since Anya arrived. Was he with you? You were already alone when we met you in the other lobby. Will just shrugged his shoulders like, how the hell should I know? Ugh, this cat. Jake sighed, then remembered that he could actually feel his cat's position thanks to the pet contract. Is not in this hall. What's he doing there? Jake sighed, then remembered that he could actually feel his cat's position thanks to the pet contract. Is not in this hall. What's he doing there? Instead of choosing a mission as planned in the Oracle Mission Hall, the duo decided to find the cat first in order to prevent the animal from doing something stupid. Jake being its owner, he would be held responsible for any infractions. Luckily for them, Crunch was not far away in the next room, the Mission Hall, reserved for missions and jobs created by other evolvers. Following the indication on his bracelet, Jake found his cat near an information terminal in the company of another feline, a leopard, or rather a female leopard. Idiot cat, come back here. Jake called out, walking with an angry stride towards the feline. Crunch continued to ignore his master's cries, continuing to sniff the leopard's behind as it was busy listening to the growling and snarling of one of the drones. The annoyed leopard's tail was flapping hard enough to slap the reckless cat, but that was not enough to deter him. As Jake was almost there, the leopard lost patience and gave a roar of warning before sending a huge smack with its claws retracted. Although the feline had held his blow, Crunch experienced this as his first turn down and a bitter sentimental failure. With his ears low, he seemed dejected, but he soon forgot his depression when Jake grabbed him by the neck again, lifting him up in the air to give him yet another sanctimonious sermon. You run off without warning to pick up a leopard? Seriously? Jake said, sputtering on the cat's head the size of a mastiff, the cat hanging in the air, not daring to move for fear of making things worse. Will, a few meters behind, froze in place trying to plead to the other aliens in the room that he had nothing to do with this man and this cat. Sarah, who had been alerted by the noise, decided to stay out of sight incognito. Even the leopard that still had its front paw up in the air ready to strike was watching them with its eyes wide open in a wary manner. No wonder the cat is so shameless. Such a pet, such a master. This was the view of many in the room, especially the few Earthlings and other humans who were present at the scene. If Jake could understand them, he probably would have yelled at his cat even louder. The two pink-haired nobles had also followed them into the hall, and the younger one was barely holding back from bursting out in laughter. "They're so dumb," she whispered to her sister Inya next door with a hand covering her mouth. "Keep it to yourself, Essia. We might end up collaborating with them." The older sister in turn lectured the young lady, but with much more elegance and discretion than Jake. Meanwhile, Crunch had learned his lesson and completely forgotten the leopard he'd grown infatuated with. When Jake put him down on the floor, he rubbed himself against his master's leg, purring as if nothing had happened, ignoring the other feline as if she no longer existed. After these months of ordeal, Jake was virtually immune to embarrassment and discomfort. Once the scolding was over, he went to an information terminal to check on available missions and job offers. Will did the same, while Sarah had finished her pickings. A list appeared in front of him with different salaries and rewards, but also sorted according to their level of difficulty. Often the difficulty was evaluated in terms of the number of ordeals or oracle rank. There could be large variations in strength between two individuals or players of the same rank, but these requirements were the minimum ability needed to qualify for the mission. It was an effective filter to avoid hiring incompetence. There were currently few missions coming from their oracle shelter, which was normal. The content of the missions was available in two languages, the Oraclean and the language of the species that wrote the job offer. Jake found two offers available in English, and upon reading them he immediately understood that they were from Cho Min Ho, promising different ether wages to anyone who joined his faction. The first was for recruiting fighters, the second for competent civilians. If someone had a particular area of expertise, those salaries could be renegotiated. The Korean did not limit his recruiting to Earthmen. Any animal or alien accepting these conditions was free to join them, although communication would be temporarily difficult. Does he have that much ether? After recruiting so many people, he should be out of money. Jake analyzed mentally, not understanding where all that ether came from. She answered him and suggested two hypotheses. It's possible that they had hunted other refugees and stolen their ether before they reached the Oracle shelter. But the most likely is that they killed a large number of digesters and used their faction's manpower to bring the bodies and blood here. Even without any demand, it's still possible to sell them cheaply directly to the Oracle store. Remembering that there was indeed a category selling organic and inorganic raw materials in the Oracle store, he decided to check it out later. He had enough Myrmidian and Cantharian blood to transfer their bloodline a dozen times. If he could replenish his ether supply by selling a few drops, it might be worth it. I wouldn't recommend it. She was adamantly against it. Those pure bloods are far too precious to be wasted like that. If you're patient and place a global advertisement here or in the Oracle store hall, you're sure to find a buyer willing to pay a high price in no time. All right, I'll stay poor then. Jake surrendered with a straight face. Returning to his original plan, he searched the global listings centralized on Thelma for a mission within his reach. He did find one that suited him. In fact, plenty. Many factions and trades on Thelma, as well as many other floating islands, needed to be supplied with fresh digester blood and meat to speed healing or feed their people. Intact corpses were also in high demand for research or for making various pieces of equipment or armor. Finally, digester corpses, and especially blood, was one of the basic materials and ingredients used by the Etherists. The ability of digester blood to attract ambient ether and to amplify vitality had countless possible applications and had the advantage of being extremely easy to obtain, since these monsters were absolutely everywhere on B842. Digester blood of rank 1 or 2 was not very valuable, since millions of digesters of this level were being massacred every day on the planet. A liter of rank 2 would sell for only 1 ether point, compared to 0.5 for rank 1. This was still more interesting than selling it directly to the Oracle store, which took them back for 0.08 and 0.007 points of ether only. The only advantage was that it was instantaneous. According to Shi, these prices were based on digester blood rates across the entire mirror universe, as well as the Oracle store's own inventory. Indeed, on ancient planets, blood of this level was worthless, and trillions of digesters of this caliber could be slaughtered in just one morning. However, blood of rank 3 and above was more valuable. Enough for Jake and Will to feel it was worth it. It was possible to accept multiple missions without time limits anyway, since digester blood supply needed to be replenished constantly. After accepting all these missions, he waited for Will to finish choosing, while Sarah rejoined them with a satisfied expression. "What did you choose?" Jake asked curiously as he saw her in such a good mood. "Like everyone else here, I guess." Sarah chuckled with a playful tone. "I'm out exterminating digesters," she added as Jake was waiting for the rest of her answer. "Oh, well, we all had the same idea, it seems." The two then kept quiet, Sarah petting Crunch to keep busy while Will joined them. The group then returned to the Oracle mission hall so Jake and Will could take a mission to exterminate digester. Again, the rewards were mediocre, 0.1 and 0.5 points for rank 1 and 2 digesters, but that was just a bonus. If they managed to kill higher-ranking digesters, the rewards would quickly become significant. It was also one of the only missions offered by the Oracle system, as digesters proliferated and progressed too quickly without regular extermination. Before the Oracle offered this type of incentive, many planets had fallen thinking they were safe in Oracle cities. Eventually ready to set off on their adventure, the group then left the pentagonal building without wasting any time, heading for the edge of the black cube. They paid the ether point needed to get out, and then reappeared on the black cube, which had become invisible again in the middle of the precipice. Now they were out again, ready to hunt and grow stronger. Chapter 170 Digester Herd. Without wasting any time, the group departed. Alas, after a few kilometers, Jake quickly became frustrated by Will's slowness. If he had gone hunting alone as he had originally intended, he probably could have covered 5 or 6 times that distance. This was the price he had to pay for spending most of his ordeal scribing for a crooked myrmidian. Jake was really wondering what Will got out of it, because he was absolutely certain that this was what the four-eyed man wanted. And unlike others, he was a man who had proved he wasn't shy or lazy about trying. He could also be counted on, or at least he had proved himself to be trustworthy until now. So Jake couldn't bring himself to leave him behind. He didn't have many friends, but he knew someone worth befriending. However, exasperated to see him sweating profusely at the modest pace of a world-class marathon runner, Jake couldn't help but ask the question on the tip of his tongue. "Will, when you wanted to be a scribe in the first ordeal, please tell me you had a plan." Will almost stumbled when he heard Jake's question, but made up for it neatly at the last minute. Searching for his words, he finally answered in a tone that was meant to be cryptic. "A plan? Not really. The only thing I know is that I want to survive like everyone else, but I also want to prosper as a businessman on this planet. My oracle paths have always been defined that way. Showing that I spoke Myrmidian to get the attention of Quintus Helvius was what I had to do to get my way. It ended badly, but that was the idea." Jake remembered the warning letter that Will had managed to get him through Crease, but he had indeed found the man with glasses a few weeks later in the arena to be sacrificed. Quintus Helvius was the fat Myrmidian who had bought Will at the auction back then. How'd you get caught anyway? With the Oracle, it shouldn't have been so hard to sneak a letter through, right? Jake picked up on the subject, mentioning the detail that had piqued his interest at the time. Will's face darkened as he recalled the events. There was a weird guy at Quintus' house. Several, actually. At the beginning of the ordeal, I could still talk to them, and the atmosphere was quite positive. I was learning things, and I could get some diluted Myrmidian blood. Helvius was very satisfied with my work. Then, one fine morning, everything had changed. Everybody was cold with me. I was getting very formal responses. Nobody spoke. It was scary. Even the chatty instructor who taught me the basics of combat changed overnight. My oracle device wasn't working properly either, often making mistakes. After a while, I noticed that every day a few slaves and servants would disappear inside the villa, never reappearing again. One evening, I heard the cry of one of the slaves and followed them. I saw her begging as Quintus Helvius ate her alive. I knew something was wrong, so I tried to escape. As I returned to my room, I heard 2 guards mention their plan to poison the recruits and gladiators of the Ludus of Servius Cassius to retrieve someone, and I wrote a letter directly to warn you. What about the blood on the letter? Jake asked, remembering the blood on the scroll. I had no choice. One of Quintus' trusted men checks the servant's mail. One of the only ones still normal, by the way. He valued me and gave me permission to give the letter to Crease, who passed it regularly. I thought it was good, but at the last moment, and without warning, he bit me on the arm, as if he wanted to eat me. I killed him with the dagger I had hidden to escape, but immediately afterwards the guards rushed as if they had witnessed everything, and I was taken prisoner. I had time to put the letter in the right basket, and Kreese came to collect the mail, without suspecting anything. End of story. The rest you know. A few days later they took me to a shabby place to be trained to fight in the arena. To be honest, I was super relieved to be out of that building full of cannibals, even though I ate porridge until the end of the ordeal after that. Well, Jake was the only one who knew it was most likely digesters. These brain eaters could remain in hibernation for years, gradually affecting the personality of their host and awakening abruptly. They would then devour the brain and take control of the nervous system to the point where they could perfectly imitate the behavior of their victims. Since Will and Sarah had not survived until the end of the ordeal, he proceeded to recount to them what they had missed. They were stunned when they heard the truth, and Will looked pale when he realized that he had spent weeks living next to undead people possessed by digesters. This only strengthened their resolve to exterminate them. Will was still using the sword that Jake had made for him from a digester's forearm, while Sarah now possessed a blood-red blade gladius similar to the one used by the Myrmidians. Jake didn't know if she had used her ordeal's credits to acquire it, but this sword looked formidable compared to his machete. Speaking of digesters, Jake, who had the best hearing by far, finally heard the shrill cackling that these monsters had the secret to. He warned Will and Sarah at his side, and the group moved into battle position, each drawing their weapons. Even Crunch had his claws out, adopting a fierce countenance for the first time. Sprinting in the direction of the high-pitched shrieks, the group finally reached an open plain with no trees or tall magenta-colored grass. There were a few shrubs, but they could clearly discern their surroundings. The pack of digesters were waiting for them in large numbers. This was a far cry from the few digesters that Jake had faced with Will and Amy. There were enough digesters in front of them to form a herd. The only problem was they weren't sheep. However, the fate of these sheep would be the same: to be eaten or to make clothes. To be exact, digesters' corpses could be used for a lot of things. Hearing their footsteps, all the digesters turned in their direction. Jake counted over 100 of them, all of them at least ranked 2 by their size. These creatures were as repulsive and uncomfortable as ever, and a few larger and more intimidating monsters were visible in the rear guard, as if they were the shepherds of this herd. There are too many of them. We need a plan, Will said with a worried expression, mechanically putting his glasses back on. Except he hadn't needed glasses since his perception had reached 25 points. He didn't have a choice. During his ordeal, he couldn't see much without his glasses, despite the perception bonus brought by the Thrustian blessing. He had to accommodate his sight by constantly squinting. Thanks to the Myrmidian blood he was consuming, his efforts had been rewarded and his senses had improved. In response, Jake, Sarah, and Crunch headed straight for the digesters' bunch. Jake stormed into a group of digesters at missile speed, ripping off limbs and crushing bones, metallic sides and chitin as he went. When he lost his inertia, he grabbed a rank 3 digester as heavy as a small car by the leg and used it as a club to smash all the monsters around him to a pulp. The monster tried to change the shape of its lower legs, the silvery metallic texture covering them suddenly bristling with thorns. Jake, far from being disturbed, concentrated his yellow constitution ether in his hand, then the red one to temporarily increase his grip. The metallic texture cracked instantly, the silvery thorns having no more effect than a hairbrush on his skin. When he was tired, he threw the half-dead monster to the ground and decapitated it with a machete. Sarah and Crunch weren't bulldozers like Jake, but they were just as deadly. The movements of the young blonde didn't have the grace of a dancer, but they were accurate. 1 or 2 strokes were usually enough to take out a digester, and her movements were fluid enough so that she was never stuck in a perilous position. As for Crunch, he cleverly followed his master, finishing off the dying digesters that Jake hadn't deigned to kill and pouncing on the isolated creatures too focused on the man-demon that was slaughtering them to bother with a cat. When one of the monsters happened to notice Crunch, a scratch was enough to break the metal sides ending their forelegs, while a bite was enough to tear off a significant portion of their flesh, most often their heart or throat. The digester's anatomy had many variations, but the vital organs were more or less the same, even if their location differed slightly. Meanwhile, Will was still frozen in place, watching his companions decimate the digesters herd before his eyes. Seconds later, he finally awoke from his trance. Fuck, if I just stand here, there won't be any more of them in a few seconds. Will cursed as he slapped his cheeks a few times with both hands to pull himself together. A moment later, Will also threw himself into the fray, blithely slashing digesters after digesters, as if it were a competition. Chapter 171 Variants. A few minutes later, the plain of low magenta grass had been repainted in silver, almost giving the impression that it had just snowed. The corpses of digesters lay in multiple pieces all over it, these voracious monsters knowing no fear, having no flight instinct. In the end, Will failed miserably, coming last in this competition that he was the only one to take seriously. In addition to joining the fight too late, he was by far the weakest, and every rank 2 digester demanded his full attention. So the result was only to be expected. Jake had single-handedly slaughtered over 80 creatures, including the majority of the rank 3 digesters. He was currently soaked in silvery blood from head to toe, and was seriously wondering if this blood could be used to make dyes. Because beyond the metallic smell that stung his nose, he had a feeling that these stains wouldn't come off so easily in the washing machine. Sarah had shot about 30 digesters on her own, demonstrating that the time of her ordeal had not been wasted. She was slightly out of breath, and her long blonde hair was also sticky with silvery blood. If Jake had been absent, she certainly could have wiped out the herd alone with a few more minutes. Even Crunch, as a good opportunist, had managed to prey on a dozen of these monsters. Unlike humans, he didn't understand the concept of resources. These digesters flailing around were just a fun game to him, and without their hostility, he could have had fun tormenting any one of them for hours. Will was therefore the most miserable of all, having killed only 6 digesters with the greatest difficulty. Without Jake or Sarah, he would have been unable to survive alone against this horde. The advantage, however, was that this battle alone had earned him about 20 ether points. At his level, it was enough to increase his strength or agility significantly. Is everyone okay? Jake asked worriedly as he saw them all covered in blood, but unharmed at first glance. I think I am okay. Will groaned as he wiped the blood off his sword with a rag. But please don't attack without warning next time. Sarah giggled when she heard his complaint. Unlike the businessman, she simply jerked her gladius to get rid of the blood on it. Unfortunately for Will, the blade made of a digester's forearm had cracked during the fight. It wouldn't hold up in another battle of this intensity. Need another weapon? Jake offered with a straight face. Without proper weapons to face the next monsters, it could quickly become dangerous, even for him. Ugh, thank you very much. Will accepted his offer outright. This was no time to get cocky and arrogant, needing no one. Like the first day on B842, Jake ripped the scythe-shaped forearm off a relatively undamaged rank 3 digester, which he hadn't completely pulverized during his berserk mode. While it had taken him a considerable amount of time the first time to carve and shape his first saber, the process was surprisingly quick this time. Jake's strength, dexterity, and intelligence was incomparable to that of the old days, and this kind of rudimentary crafting required virtually no effort on his part. Not to mention the fact that the edge of his machete had been reinforced with gray ether. Aware that such a situation could happen again, for example, if his machete broke, he was neither short of tape nor strong glue. His only concern was that he wasn't sure that these earth products could withstand high-intensity evolver combat. There was a real risk that the blade would become dislodged from its makeshift handle, another bone split at one end to insert the blade, and escape into the air, leaving its owner helpless with only the remaining hilt of the saber as a weapon. It's really impressive. Sarah expressed her admiration for Jake's craftsmanship. It gave her a good idea of the difference between their stats and especially intelligence. His gestures were precise and decisive as if he had done this thousands of times, which was impossible. He was also considerably stronger than in her memory of the Colosseum. If she didn't do her utmost, the gap could widen even further as time went by. And Sarah didn't want to be discarded at all, now that she had proved that she could be something more than just a cheap seductress. Jake was a loner, not very talkative and tactless, but at least he inspired confidence. The way he scolded his cat in public showed his silly side, but that was precisely what reassured her in those circumstances. In her opinion, Amy had made a mistake by leaving the group so early. Her instincts told her that powerful people with integrity weren't so common in the mirror universe. Jake and Will were no angels, focused on their goals, but they were mentally very stable. She was much more suspicious of Kyle comparatively, who, although he had a good background, didn't have the same emotional maturity. She still didn't know how much the ordeal had changed him. Jake quickly finished Will's new saber. Now that he had replenished his ether, he was in a generous mood. To prevent the situation from happening again so soon, he spent 50 ether points to encode 10 gray ether points for Will's saber. Of course, it wasn't for free. He first explained to Will the role of this ether and reminded him that he would have to pay him back sooner or later. Will accepted willingly. On the sharpness and strength of his weapon depended both his survival and his ability to accumulate more ether. There was no question of being stingy in this situation. Now that Jake had almost 900 ether points again, he took the opportunity to increase his extrasensory perception by another 10 points, bringing it to 40 points. The control range of his ether increased by another meter, and his control became easier from a distance, like a muscle becoming more flexible when extended beyond its limits. His only regret was that at this rate, he would have to wipe out a couple of hundred more groups of digesters like this one to promote his Oracle rank to the next level. The gauge indicating Sergeant, rank 5 equals 406 for 100/100 million was enough to depress anyone. As they were about to fill their empty bottles and gourds with fresh digester blood, a shrill sound different from the usual digester cackles they used to hear came from the dark wood further filled with bluish trunks with no foliage. The magenta grasses had regained their rights once they were out of the plain, as if growing in an open area at the mercy of red lightning wasn't doing them any good. This made it difficult to spot the creatures hiding underneath. After a while, Jake heard the rustle of tall grass being crushed or moving aside to make way for a rather heavy creature. Crunch, which was happily devouring one digester's thigh, suddenly abandoned his meal, growling his exposed fangs towards the forest. The group soon saw the silhouette of the creature walking towards them. They were two, in fact, almost identical, but the rustle of the grass had not disappeared. There was something else in the woods, responsible for his cat's defensive posture. These two monsters were undoubtedly digesters. Bipedal, they shared most of the characteristics of their brethren. Silver forearm constantly changing shapes, a batracian skin, slightly translucent allowing to glimpse their venous network, as well as robust legs capable of reversing the direction of their joints at will. And finally, a single eye the size of a baseball on a tiny head with an enormous jaw that seems capable of stretching itself to infinity. Their size exceeding 3 meters in height, and the fluidity and speed of transformation of the extremities of their limbs, including feet, indicated that they were rank 3 digester. But the similarities ended there. Their supposedly silvery eye was glowing with a red light, and the heat of an oven radiated from their bodies, deforming the heated air around them. Their grayish batracian skin was slightly pinkish, as if both digesters had sunburned. Their necks were also longer, like a long tube. Upon seeing them, the two monsters' chests swelled abruptly, an incandescent glow visible through their skin. Then after a few seconds, their chests stopped swelling and they opened their jaws. Chapter 172 Headache. The whole group, including Crunch, sensed that something was wrong when the two monsters opened their mouths wide. The incandescent light rose quickly from their chests to their long tube-shaped necks, and a fireball escaped from their mouths with the power of an artillery shot. The two projectiles were no bigger than a ping-pong ball, rather pitiful at first glance, but Jake had no doubt that it would be lethal to take one head-on, even for him. Grabbing his cat by the neck and Will by the collar of his jacket, he leapt with all his strength in the air to leave the impact zone. Sarah, for her part, dived in a forward roll towards the two monsters, passing successfully under the two balls of fire. The two flaming ping-pong balls hit the ground a fraction of a second later, and like two air bubbles bursting brutally, an explosion louder than a grenade deafened their eardrums. Upon landing, Jake had a chance to inspect the extent of the damage after putting down a Crunch and Will shaken. In addition to leaving a crater 5 meters in diameter and 1 meter deep, the flames continued to burn as if these projectiles contained some kind of flammable oil or gasoline. Meanwhile, Sarah had managed to get close to them and successfully remove their heads without a hitch. although the hot air burned her skin to the first degree during the short time she came into contact with it. Picking up the ether, she returned to Jake with the conquering gait of a proud woman demanding compliments. "Well," Sarah taunted him in a sexy pose with her hands akimbo. "Not bad," Jake said in bad faith with a sorrowful face. That ether could have been his. "Will and Crunch, I'm adding the rescue to your debt," Jake informed the two rescued with extreme seriousness. In response, Crunch sat on his butt, then lifted one of his hind legs up to lick his balls, as if to say, "You've already taken all my ether, what difference does it make to me?" As for Will, he was a businessman. Short reckonings made the best friends. As long as Jake reasoned like that, they'd get along just fine, even if he suspected Jake was joking. Or maybe he wasn't. Jake was about to inspect the two bodies when he looked out into the woods again. The rustle of the tall grass still hadn't disappeared. Straining his ear, he could hear multiple similar sounds. But in addition to that, there were two other distinct noises. The first was a buzzing sound that was reminiscent of mosquitoes, but much more deafening. The second was an indescribable sound, a mixture of suction noise mixed with a strange rattle. "How are we going to share?" Jake interrupted Will with a wave of his hand to signal them to shut up. Watching him cautiously peering through the woods, his two companions regained their concentration. This time Crunch and Will had learned their lesson and backed off about 10 meters to avoid any unpleasant surprises. In the end, it wasn't the creatures in the tall grass that showed up first, but those responsible for the buzzing. Raising their heads slightly towards the noise, Jake and Sarah discovered two flying insects the size of a prehistoric dragonfly. This was their only common trait with the harmless earth insect. These two monsters were also digesters, no doubt about it. 6 legs capable of changing shape, lengthening or shortening at will, as were their 4 razor-sharp wings. Both insects had 4 faceted silvery eyes and a translucent gray exoskeleton covering every part of their body. They also had a pair of mandibles on their heads and a long, mosquito-like, sharp trunk. In appearance, these digesters were smaller than the previous ones, about the size of the rank 0 and 1 digesters that Jake hadn't seen for a long time. Yet Jake took the threat seriously this time. The two insects were moving so fast that he could barely follow them with his eyes despite his ether agility of 130. Except maybe Sarah, the rest of the group would be unable to react to the creatures. Before swooping down on them, the 2 mosquitoes landed on the 2 fire-breathing digesters' corpses by sticking their 6 sharp legs into their abdomen. Their trunks pierced the thick skin of the digesters, and an unpleasant sucking sound was heard. Their proboscis, 1 or 2 centimeters in diameter, suddenly stretched more than 10 times its width while the blood of the dead digesters was sucked out at a dazzling speed. The area around the proboscis had also liquefied as if under the effect of an anticoagulant toxin so powerful that it could even soften the bones. If a human being was stung by this, their vital prognosis would be directly compromised even if their blood was not absorbed. As they watched the scene, Jake and Sarah got a chill. "Take Will and Crunch and run." Jake gave the order quietly. "I should be able to handle them, but they have to attack me," he added, sensing she was about to make an unnecessary protest. Luckily, she had a good head on her shoulders. She knew these 2 digesters were beyond her reach. She might be able to escape by herself, but it would be fatal for Will and the cat if they were targeted. The young woman leapt to the 2 deadweights, and like Jake earlier, she grabbed them without warning, one by the collar, the other by the neck. She then sprinted at full speed towards the Oracle shelter, leaving Jake alone to face the threat. In the few seconds it had taken Sarah to escape, both corpses had been vampirized and reduced to the size of a small dog. The next second, when there was nothing left to absorb, the skin was swallowed up as well, passing through the tube like an inverted sock. There was absolutely nothing left of the 2 fire-breathing digesters. The most amazing thing was that the 2 digesters had not changed in size, their abdomens had not swollen. Apart from a slight silvery halo around their bodies showing that they had successfully digested the energy and ether, there was no indication that the 2 mosquitoes had just eaten a meal that was at least 10 times their weight. Jake had no more crystals to increase his stats further, but he decided that his life was worth more than a few ether points. Focusing firmly, he used 210 ether points to boost his strength and agility by 70 points. bringing his 2 stats to a staggering 200 points. His perception of time slowed abruptly, his own breaths suddenly seeming endless. He also felt even lighter, if that was possible. But it couldn't be that simple. After increasing his ether stats so much, a severe headache hammered into his skull. The concentration needed to keep the excess ether from leaving his body was like trying to lift a 100 kilograms bar for a normal human. Assuming it was possible, this effort could not be held for more than a few seconds. Feeling the urgency of the situation, Jake scanned both monsters with his bracelet to get the crucial information he needed to plan his strategy. Rank 4 digester, regular, insect type, mosquito digesters born insects, or having consumed many insectoid creatures before stabilizing. Their chitin exoskeleton is stronger than steel, and their legs are as sharp as any sword and can elongate. They can vampirize and poison their victim through the proboscis, but each leg, wing, and mandible is venomous. Their intelligence is limited, but they can be controlled and commanded by other higher-ranking insect or psychic-type digesters. Memorizing what he needed to know with a thought, he pulled out his machete and then pounced on the 2 mosquitoes before they could take off again, leaving a shock wave behind him. The last sentence of the scan report had caught his attention. If the uncomfortable sucking noise he heard in the tall grass was the digester commanding these 2 mosquitoes, he had to finish them off as quickly as possible and run away. The 2 blood-sucking digesters were as fast as he expected. Despite his speed, their wings vibrated in time, and his sword missed them as his swatter used to miss the flies. And as his migraine continued to grow in intensity while he wondered how to reach those digesters flying above him in the shortest possible time, the hideous monster he did not wish to see so soon finally crawled out of the tall grass. Chapter 173, The Slug Part 1. Despite the buzzing noise above him and the headache urging him to exterminate the mosquitoes as quickly as possible, Jake was forced to divert his attention from the 2 digesters to greet the newcomer. The tall magenta grass at the entrance to the woods was suddenly crushed by a huge, sticky, smelly mass so eerie that Jake couldn't tell which way the head was pointing. The new creature was some sort of huge greenish shit-colored slug, about 20 feet long and probably weighing a couple of tons. Like any mollusk, the digester was crawling awfully slowly to the point of looking harmless, but a feeling of hostility and cruelty radiated from the monster. 2 mosquito digesters similar to those flying above it rested on the monster's back, their trunks completely embedded in the creature's flabby, slimy skin. The slug continued to crawl indiscriminately as the 2 mosquitoes on its back obediently sipped the silvery blood of the mollusk. Jake was completely petrified with disgust at the repulsive appendage of the monster, which seemed to be by the greatest of wonders its head. The extremity in question had no eyes, nose, or ears. Multiple translucent gray antennae grew at its top like weeds, wriggling regularly, as if they were smelling the air, the sensory organ of the monster. Perhaps the most shocking thing was its mouth. It looked like a gigantic anus. The way it contracted and relaxed to the rhythm of the beating of a resting heart. One might have thought that the digester was constipated and that Jake was staring at the wrong side of the creature by misfortune. Unfortunately, it wasn't an anus, but the digester's mouth, and the digester had a strong urge to vomit something. When the slug spotted Jake, it emitted a disturbing whale's cry that sounded like a cry of joy while vomiting a yellowish liquid that melted the grass and the ground beneath it. The acceleration of the wriggling of its antennae betrayed its excitement. As if this call was a signal, the rustle from the tall grass grew louder, and about 10 digesters sprang up from the brush before Jake could even consider a plan of attack. With the exception of one of the monsters, all of the new digesters were rank 3 fire-spitting variants like the ones Sarah had decapitated earlier. As if they were obeying an order, each creature took up a position in front of the slug, forming an arc of a circle with their mouths wide open, all pointing at Jake. The last digester, who left the woods last, looked like the rank 2 and 3 digesters he was used to, but bigger and more intimidating. It was a humanoid creature 4 meters tall whose transforming abilities had extended to all of its limbs. Instead of forearms and feet that could be transformed into different forms of weapons and pieces of armor, the monster's arms and legs were now covered with a thick layer of liquid silver that was constantly changing shape to form spikes. blades, or protective plates. The creature also had a tail several meters long of the same silver color. From the way it wiggled, it was clear that it was perfectly controllable. Jake needed to keep the initiative if he was to have any chance of survival, and that's exactly what he did. He scanned the slug, one of the flame spitters, and the last humanoid digester, without batting an eyelid with his bracelet. Rank 5, variant, irregular, insect type, larva, an abnormal digester whose abilities and evolutionary direction are unpredictable. This digester has unbalanced stats, both physically and etherically. His strong points are a phenomenal vitality and a high intelligence, allowing him to control other digesters using his hive mind. This type of digester emits a nectar that is extremely attractive to other digesters, with hordes easily forming around them. Other suspected abilities: acid, poison, regeneration. Rank 3, variant, regular, humanoid type, fire spitter's normal digester having devoured materials or living beings with ether skill or bloodline related to fire or heat. They can also spontaneously spawn from the atmosphere in hot or volcanic areas. Their ether or physical attributes are slightly below average, but compensated by their ether ability. Rank 4, regular, humanoid type, infantry, one of the most common evolutionary pathways for digesters. They are born humanoid or become humanoid after devouring various humanoid or bipedal species. Digesters appearing near areas densely populated by humans or humanoids tend to be derived from their appearance. Balanced physical attributes, limited intelligence. At this point, Jake only needed a cursory glance to retain all that information. After reading the 3 reports, he took immediate action. The headache kept worsening, and a simple distraction was all it would take for all the excess ether in his body to get out of control and dissipate. If such a catastrophe occurred, he would no longer have a headache, but his chances of survival would be significantly reduced. His first target was the fire spitters. Before the monsters could even aim at him properly and open their mouths, Jake had already sprinted to one of them, beheading it with a sword. The fire spitters were too slow to follow his movements, and by the time they noticed that one of their comrades was dead, he had already killed another. In less than 3 seconds, he decapitated each of the rank 3s without a devastating fireball being fired. The roughly 80 ether points he earned were immediately reinvested to increase his ether of intelligence, instantly relieving his migraine and giving him the time he needed to regain control of the situation. Moreover, gaining intelligence was by far the most invigorating and exhilarating feeling he had ever experienced. Even a few more points were enough to make a difference. Just as with agility, the perception of time improved, planning became easier, and ether control became more refined, not to mention the weird feeling of heightened concentration. The digesters had so far been unable to show any coordination. The 2 mosquitoes of rank 4 were still circling above him, waiting for them to lower their guard, while the other 2 were pumping nectar from the slug, indifferent to the death of their fellows. Only the rank 4 humanoid was really paying attention to Jake. The slug also had the human in its sights, but its agility was woefully low, making it unable to keep track of his movements. It was not until after the fire spitters were dead that the slug uttered another discordant wail call. The other 5 rank 4 digesters reacted to this cry as if under a spell. The 2 mosquitoes on the slug's back took off in a mighty buzz, while the other 2 flying insects finally swooped down on Jake, as if finding a weak spot wasn't so important anymore. As Jake was about to cross swords with these insects, the humanoid digester bumped into him. His arms crossed in front of him, forming a thick silver plate covered with long blades and thorns more than a meter long. Jake, who was already controlling his sword to block and deflect the untimely attacks of the insects, was forced to change his posture. Seeing the blades and thorns of the shield rushing towards him in slow motion to impale him, he grabbed one of the long thorns with his free hand and jumped in the opposite direction. Then, with his arms sheathed, he let himself be carried away by the monster's unstoppable charge. This was another of the advantages of high ether stats. A normal human, even if he had enough grip to grasp one of the thorns, would have simply broken his wrist and still been impaled and smashed. With tremendous strength, it was different. Jake perceived his current 95 kilograms as the equivalent of only 3-4 kilos. He could easily stand perfectly straight in the air horizontally with just the strength of his wrist. In other words, as long as Jake had a grip, it was virtually impossible to destabilize him or make him lose his balance unless the speed and force of impact far exceeded what his body and senses could handle. Far from putting him in trouble, the monster's surprise charge had actually allowed him to distance himself from the 4 insectoid digesters. The digester warrior was undoubtedly a formidable opponent, but its physical stats were balanced. With a body much more robust than a human and ether stats around 70, this digester was in principle superior to him. But that was not counting the drastic gap in intelligence and extrasensory perception that separated them. Chapter 170 for the Slug Part 2. As soon as Jake had a moment's respite, he made the monster pay for its mistake with a one-stroke attack. While the digester's sight was still obscured by its shield-shaped crossed arms, Jake slashed the blades and thorns protruding from the shield to clear a path, then stabbed it in the middle towards what he thought was the creature's head. His arm lit up with red, orange, and yellow, and as if the time had just speeded up, the arm suddenly stretched out, letting out the sound of a whip crack. Also guiding the sharpness gray ether on the tip of its machete, the blade easily pierced the metal plates forming the monster's arms, and a split second later punctured the creature's eye and brain. The digester stood still for a moment, then collapsed backwards when Jake pulled out his blade. Still in a precarious situation, Jake absorbed the monster's ether, which he spent once again to increase his intelligence by an additional 2 points. The headache diminished another notch, and although it wasn't yet perfect, he was out of the critical phase. After eliminating the small fry and the key fighter, Jake was finally starting to find his rhythm and regain his confidence. Battling humans or digesters were two very different experiences. Facing humans, you could still train yourself by practicing various martial arts. The human anatomy was generally well known. Not everyone was a doctor, but it was easy to locate vital organs such as the heart, lungs, liver, or genitals. With the digesters, aliens, and even some animals in general, predicting their anatomy and weak points was much more risky. His scan LVL-3 did not currently provide this information, providing only sketchy information. There were no martial arts to effectively defend and counter these creatures. A tactic that worked on one could be completely ineffective on another. These monsters were also impervious to fear or other limiting negative emotions. A fight against a digester was always a fight to the death. However, he was beginning to realize that he had made more progress than he had imagined. Those digesters that seemed so terrifying to him before the ordeal, and that he wasn't sure he could dominate a few seconds earlier, weren't so terrible after all. The supposedly most dangerous rank 5 didn't seem to be suitable for dealing with balanced and fast fighters like Jake. As long as he kept his distance from the slug, he didn't have much to fear. The real danger in the end was the bugs. A sting would probably be fatal, while their speed remained difficult to follow even after his agility had reached 200 points. The initial difficulty was getting to them, but the problem was partially solved now that the 4 insects had been ordered to attack him at all costs. Less than a second after finishing the humanoid digester, the 4 mosquitoes were already on him. Focusing the sharpness ether on the cutting edge of his blade, Jake intercepted the first insect with his machete. Due to their initial speed, the 2 severed halves of the mosquitoes continued on their way without slowing down on either side of Jake. The slug emitted another long, high-pitched wail after this failure, and the mosquitoes began to swirl cautiously again shortly afterwards as if they had just received a new instruction. Regardless, Jake was not one to miss opportunities. By the time the other 3 flying insects regained altitude, he managed by jumping to catch one of the digesters in the air. His machete sliced through the air above his head, and the lower half of the creature and 2 wings were immediately separated from the rest of the body. With the flying digesters high in the air, he took the opportunity to free his backpack from his shoulders and then remove the assault rifle he had never used before. He would have preferred to refrain from using his bullets, but at the speed at which these digesters were gaining in strength and resistance, he was not sure that these firearms would be useful for much longer. If he had been able to find a few rocks, he was confident that he could headshot these mosquitoes with a few good throws. The problem was that he was not sure that this would be enough to kill them, and that apart from grass and small shrubs there was nothing else on this plane. The pebbles could not be strengthened by his ether at this distance, and he was not confident that he could break their metallic chitin exoskeleton by brute force alone. Taking a deep breath, he pointed the assault rifle at the slug first, that he was certain that the mosquitoes would be on him in no time if he decided to rush the rank 5. But if he did that, he was exposing himself to very real risks. That acid vomit didn't exactly fill him with confidence. The oracle path ensuring his survival was not indicating any particular danger, the shadow guide remaining motionless. But that was the result of the oracle system's inability to include the digesters in its calculations. He felt that by using repeated scanning, it should be possible to predict their movement. But since the information obtained was limited, it was obvious that it was not so easy for his bracelet to obtain crucial and up-to-date information about these creatures. The little information that the LVL-3 scan had revealed simply matched the information contained in the Oracle's database that his rank allowed him to access. Ta-da-da-ta-da. The bullets embedded themselves in the sticky skin covering what Jake thought was the head. His accuracy was exceptional, despite the fact that his one-handed shooting posture was ridiculously non-academic. This was due to his very high agility and perception, as well as the short distance separating him from the monster. Hearing the slug screaming in pain, Jake thought for a brief moment that his assault rifle would be able to finish it off, but he soon sobered up. The bullets penetrated a few inches into the monster's skin, but no silver blood oozed from the wounds. Worse, a few seconds later the bullets gradually rose to the surface before falling to the ground, like when someone tries to stick his finger into a fat belly. The skin had definitely been pierced, but the clotting was almost instantaneous. A few seconds later, the slug was completely healed as if it had not been shot at all. Fuck, Jake cursed. Focusing his attention on the mosquitoes instead, he sprayed them with bullets with his assault rifle, aiming as best he could. But the insects were so fast that most of the bullets missed. Only the mosquito that had been badly wounded before was shot. Stunned by a bullet in the skull, the insect fell to the ground like a stone, and Jake finished it off by crushing its skull with his foot. If the other mosquitoes didn't want to come down, he had only two possible plans left: to flee or to physically attack the slug. His instincts told him that attacking the slug would be a bad idea, and he didn't intend to gamble his life on a coin toss. He had bought enough time for Sarah to get away with Will and Crunch anyway. But somehow, just as he was thinking about leaving, he felt his vision blurred. "Careful, Jake. Looks like you've been poisoned," she warned him with an alarmed voice. But when? Jake replayed the last actions and came to the only possible conclusion. The mosquitoes hadn't touched him, neither had the slug. The flying insects had a clearly identified poison from their proboscis or the ends of their legs and wings. It couldn't have been them. Since it could only be the slug, he logically associated his vision impairment with the gunshot wounds he had inflicted on the creature. As he scrutinized the creature more carefully, he noticed a multitude of open pores on the digester's viscous skin. Gas. That could explain why the other insects were flying so high. Drawing the appropriate decisions, Jake exhaled the air from his lungs, and then, with empty lungs, he sprinted towards the oracle shelter. His vision became increasingly blurry as his limbs grew heavier, but his great constitution and vitality were not to be underestimated. This poison did not appear to be of the lethal type like that of some snakes or insects. The objective seemed to be to paralyze the victims, and if that was all it could do, he could escape from them without any problem. Uncorking his gourd full of fresh digester blood, he gulped down all the contents to the point where he felt like puking. Because it was grade 3 blood, his constitution and vitality instantly quadrupled, and this gave him the energy he needed to fight the effect of the poison. While the mosquitoes were reluctant to pursue him by abandoning the slug, Jake kept speeding up, disappearing soon after into the tall grass in the face of frustrated and helpless digesters. Chapter 175 New Mission. Jake certainly hadn't said his last word. However, he did know when he was at a disadvantage. Maybe an opportunity would have come along eventually, or a few lucky shots would have allowed him to reach the other flying digesters, but he could not guarantee it. Just for that alone, he did not regret refusing to absorb Lucia's Myrmidian bloodline. Simply running away with his tail between his legs would probably have caused him to lose 20% of his stats considering the strength of the Myrmidian pureblood. To avoid the inconvenience, he would have been forced to fight until victory or death ensued. This severely limited his options, and for a rational person like him it was a risk he refused to take. After sprinting for several minutes without stopping, he finally slowed down to catch his breath. With his ether strength and agility at 200 points and his stamina quadrupled thanks to the digester's blood, he had briefly reached 700 kilometers per hour. It was an exhilarating feat, where Jake could clearly feel the air resistance at that speed. The sound barrier wasn't that far away. The problem was that his actual constitution was only 130 points with the bonus of 30 yellow crystals. Digester's blood quadrupled his constitution and vitality, but it should not be forgotten that these stats were compound stats made up of other variables. As much as his stamina had increased substantially, his body toughness hadn't changed much. This meant that after running at twice the speed that his bones, muscles, and tendons were able to support, they were not in such great shape. His high vitality ensured good tissue regeneration, but it would take several hours, even with digester's blood, to heal such injuries. Again, this was a risk he could not take. The only good news was that the paralytic poison had been properly removed from his system. With a liver and a metabolism that was 40 times more efficient than normal, he could metabolize this type of dangerous molecule very quickly. Of course, that was only if his liver and kidneys were intact, and to the extent that these foreign molecules could be metabolized by him. If this was not the case, the toxins would be expelled by vomiting, sweating, urinating, as well as breathing. During these few minutes of escape, Jake had been sweating heavily, and not only because of his high running speed, heating up his body to temperatures that would be lethal to a normal human. His body was covered with an abnormally acidic, foul-smelling sweat, and he felt as if he had just passed through a night with a fever of 40 degrees Celsius, although this had never happened to him before. Finally, he had one last trouble to which he saw no obvious solution right now. The problem of his overloaded ether stats and his persistent headache. It wasn't as intense as a little earlier, but it was still extremely painful. It was preventing him from thinking as usual, and it was getting harder and harder to control the ether excess. Since he couldn't be sure that he hadn't been chased, Jake continued to trot at a more reasonable speed, for 100 kilometers per hour, towards the rest of his group, tracking them with the help of his shadow guide. When he was certain that the digesters had given up chasing him, he took a short break and used the opportunity to pull out the 100 empty crystals in his possession. Originally, there were 30 red, orange, and yellow crystals respectively, with the remaining 10 crystals dedicated to intelligence. This configuration was no longer possible if he wanted to keep his ether. To immediately relieve his headache, Jake guided 50 points of ether of strength and agility into the empty crystals. With his mental fatigue, the procedure took him a few minutes, after which his ether strength and agility dropped to 150 points. It was still high, but his headache was almost gone, as if the clamp around his skull had just been removed. Now that Jake could think normally again, he set off once more, this time reflecting seriously on his next plan. Jake didn't have the arrogance to say that he would never lose focus. All he needed was a brief moment of sleep or some strong emotion for him to lose the surplus of ether that his body contained. He could certainly continue to increase his ether of intelligence to increase his mental strength and cognitive abilities, but in the medium term it was the same as a snake biting its own tail. Using the metaphor of the bottle, if the mind acted as a pressure stopper forcing the excess ether into the bottle, strengthening the mind with the ether of intelligence was like saying that the liquid in the bottle was used to get more liquid in and to keep it in the bottle. It was true that it was the role of the liquid, the ether, to strengthen the bottle, the body, and the cap, the mind, but at the source, it was all just ether. There was bound to be a point of no return where the spirit itself would no longer be able to contain the ether composing it, and at the origin of its power. After all, his soul was not yet considered stable according to the oracle's definition. In the short term, the best plan was to get hold of more unused crystals to store his ether overflow in order to get his ether stats back to normal. Finding an etherist would be ideal, but they didn't grow on trees. As if the oracle system had heard his laments, the coaching feature of his bracelet that hadn't manifested itself since the last ordeal popped out a new mission suddenly. Mission: save Enya and Essie of Velsiel. Potential reward: their gratitude/friendship, ether crystals. Note: time is running out. They must be rescued within the next hour or their chances of survival will become unpredictable. Jake grunted inside as he discovered the mission. For sure, the coach played his role well this time by proposing a mission that represented a real opportunity for him. The rub was that there were certainly other, simpler ways to get the crystals. Starting with the tens of thousands of refugees who probably had no use for their already consumed crystals. By now Jake had figured out that the Oracle system wasn't that impartial. His goals remained unclear to him and she. On the surface, this mission seemed to serve his interests, but it was also likely that the Oracle wanted these two young women to survive longer. As if their time hadn't come yet. The only familiar name was Enya, and the only person he knew by that name was the young woman with pink hair. Essia must have been the other woman who looked very much like her. It also made Jake realize that the Oracle could give his name and surname without his permission to other people under the pretext of a vulgar mission. Even if it was to save them, who's to say it would always be with such good intentions? With his running speed, he finally managed to catch up with Sarah, who had halted to await his return. Carrying Will and Crunch wasn't difficult, but it wasn't so easy for a woman of her size either, especially with a bad grip. When they saw him arrive, the group was startled, but their worry was soon replaced by relief. They didn't feel serene after leaving him behind, all alone. "You're not hurt." Sarah inspected him from head to toe as she circled his body. "I'm okay, but I have an emergency right now," Jake explained concisely. "Take Will and Crunch back to the Oracle City. I have another coach mission to complete now, or it will be too late." He promised to explain the rest in detail on his return, but fortunately, they were all very understanding and did not insist. There was no sun visible with these black clouds loaded with red lightning, but it was getting late. The luminosity had begun to fade. With his perception, as long as there was some light, Jake could see just fine, but for Will it was far too risky. Crunch was the only one who might be more in his element at this hour, but what he needed the most to succeed in his mission was speed. Crunch would only slow him down. As for Sarah, she was free to go out hunting again or join him after escorting them back. They were pretty close to the shelter, so it would only take her a few more minutes to make the round trip if she wanted to. The group then bid each other farewell, and Jake vanished into the tall grasses in a gust of wind.